back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a massive week of World War III analysis, one of the biggest weeks in recent memory that I can recall. And we're going to be discussing a whole host of issues. Pretty much every front is erupting. We're going to be talking about the failed Gaza ceasefire as the Israelis increase their efforts to genocide the Gazans. They start to annex openly parts of Gaza. So we're going to be discussing that. We're going to be discussing the Houthis renewing their assaults on Israel. Now the U.S. declaring direct war on the Houthis in a sustained airstrike campaign to bring them down, to stop them, and to protect Israel. This is, of course, coupled with new threats against Iran, a new letter that Trump sent to Ayatollah Khamenei that basically outlines if there's not a nuclear deal within 2 months, the Iranians can expect to be struck by Israeli and U.S. strikes. We're going to be talking about the situation in Syria and Lebanon as Israel continues to escalate there, as well as the enormous protests in Turkey against Erdogan as he arrests his main political opposition. We're going to be breaking all of that down, as well as, of course, the huge breaking JFK files news. We may be bringing you some Ether Hour content on that later this week, but we're going to be discussing the leaks. We're going to be discussing how it implicates Israel, CIA directors and officers. We're going to be talking about the whole situation there, a brief rundown today, and then again, maybe more content later. We're going to be obviously talking about Russia, Ukraine, as Trump calls Putin as this supposed energy infrastructure ceasefire comes into effect. It appears that it's already been broken. So we're going to be breaking down all of that, as well as, of course, frontline news from the war there. Also, the news from Germany as Merz is apparently on the verge of resigning if his deal with the SPD doesn't go through. News from Romania, news from Bosnia and Herzegovina as Dodik has a nationwide arrest warrant issued for him. And of course, we're going to be talking about some church news as always. But before you dive into this episode, everybody be sure to check out our Ether Hour this week. We have a great World War III status update with none other than Jim Jatras, a great friend of ours. So be sure to check that Ether Hour episode up. It's going to be linked down below. And like this episode as well. Like and share it. Obviously, these episodes don't get seen by as many people if you don't hit that like. So if you're listening and you're a fan of the show, please do whatever you can. Like, share. It really helps us out. And of course, to listen to the Ether Hour, get behind that paywall, and it will also keep the show going. One other housekeeping item, I should be doing my first live stream, World War Live, as I'm going to be calling it, on Tuesday. So you're listening to this probably on a Sunday. Prepare for that. I'm going to be sending the links out for that to everybody on the Substack. So with all of that, I'm glad everybody is here. Thank you all for tuning into the show. It's going to be a big week of analysis. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It has been an enormous week of news, of course, commencing in the Middle East. As you've said, the craziness, of course, is taking place again with Israel leading the charge into Gaza, causing at least at this point between 500 and 1,000 deaths. And of course, most of these people being innocent, hundreds of children being killed in record time, frankly. I think the Israelis even broke their own record from the previous year and a half in exactly this particular week in the Gaza Strip. And yes, there are Israeli politicians calling for essentially an annexation of the entirety of Gaza. Trump's peace plan seemingly has failed. Of course, Trump is probably, and the Republicans are seething right now because their reputation in terms of being the peacekeepers in this Middle Eastern zone are falling down the drain. And in fact, Trump is not in a position to exactly scold Netanyahu for what's going on, but at the same time, he needs to provide some sort of answer for what's happening. Otherwise, he will appear seemingly like Joseph Biden, the previous president of America. So in some ways, Trump is stuck between a rock and a hard place, whilst he's, of course, negotiating things with Russia and between Iran and the other Middle Eastern countries. The US is in a tight situation here in Israel because, frankly, the footage coming out of the Gaza Strip now, because the ceasefire has provided some respite for the Palestinians, is quite insane. And all the footage is new. You can't say the footage is fake. The Israelis have officially destroyed one of the only hospitals, I believe it was the only hospital in the Gaza Strip that was providing chemotherapy and radiotherapy to cancer patients. And as you can imagine, a lot of these bombardments and, of course, the destruction of homes leaves asbestos as well as other chemicals that infect local Palestinians, and they do develop cancer, and there were already cancer patients in Gaza, and now the only hospital able to treat them has been shut down. So whether these cancer patients even go in Gaza, there's probably thousands of them. They'll have to travel either to Egypt or Jordan, and they cannot do that because they simply have no means to. And humanitarian aid is, of course, not well developed enough. Even these United Nations field hospitals are not stationed. They do not have the facilities to treat cancer patients. And unfortunately, we see not just the malnutrition, but also the lack of medical care actually reaching the Palestinian people. So a huge tragedy taking place there, and no real reaction from the Russian Federation, China, or any of the other BRICS countries, because I believe no one really expected Netanyahu to double down And all of this is happening whilst there are still protests ongoing in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Tel Aviv, all these places, protests against Netanyahu. And in fact, the former Supreme Court Justice of the Israeli court has openly stated that he believes there will be a potential civil war in Israel in the near future. So the Israeli people, even amongst themselves, are divided. And just as in the Old Testament, the southern kingdom of Judea went and fought against Israel, so will, I think, the modern day state of Israel will also potentially fight against itself, as we've seen, not just through the firings of all these top military, top Air Force officials, but also in the political realm. I think Netanyahu's days are numbered, and all of these external military victories are going to be soaked in this particular bloodletting that he's, of course, allowed both in Syria through the dismantling of the Assad government, which, of course, everybody's paying attention to, and, of course, what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza. So the tragedy, of course, of the Palestinian people continues, and despite all the hope that's been provided to Palestine through the ceasefire, the short-lived, several-week-long break that's been put on since the Trump inauguration, of course, the fighting has restarted, and it seems like Israel is going for the killing blow now, Conrad. And we have seen all of those Hamas fighters during the ceasefire, during the hostage exchanges. There does seem to be a lot of Hamas personnel on the ground, so it doesn't look like they're going to be bending the knee anytime soon, and they're most likely going to fight back. So will we see perhaps an entire annexation of half of Gaza from the middle northwards? North of Gaza is mostly already occupied by Israeli forces, but they'll most likely will be moving into the southern refugee camps. And the big discussion of what should happen to the Palestinian people of Gaza, and we don't say this question we don't sort of put this question in a imperialistic fashion. It's just simply, it's being put to us by the liberal imperialistic elites around the world, the globalist capitalists who are stating, well, the Gazan Palestinians would probably be better off living somewhere in Africa, perhaps in Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula, in the desert, in these long-term refugee camps just across the border, away from their homelands. So again, I think this is the fate that they're preparing for the Palestinians, either death or permanent exile, just like the White Army and the Russian Orthodox Christian refugees at the end of the Civil War when the Bolsheviks took over.
Now, that's very much what's going on. The civilian casualties are already back to, those daily horrific levels that we saw, before the ceasefire began, which, again, everybody's saying, oh, Hamas is the reason the ceasefire failed. We're getting the words from the White House and Trump. It says, Trump fully supports Israel's Gaza slaughter. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said Thursday that President Trump fully supports Israel's renewed massive bombing campaign in Gaza, which has killed at least 200 children since Tuesday. The president made it very clear to Hamas that if they did not release all of the hostages, there would be hell to pay. Unfortunately, Hamas chose to play games in the media with lives. The U.S. and Israel are blaming Hamas for the lack of a continued ceasefire and hostage releases, but it was Israel that repeatedly violated the deal signed in January, which would have led to the release of all Israeli captives, a permanent truce, and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Leavitt said that President Trump fully supports Israel and the IDF and the actions that they've taken in recent days. And the big recent announcement, of course, from Israel Katz is that he says that I have instructed the IDF to seize additional areas in Gaza while evacuating the population and to expand the security zones around Gaza for the protection of Israeli communities and IDF soldiers. He said on Friday, the more Hamas persists in its refusal to release the hostages, the more territory it will lose, which will be annexed by Israel. On Wednesday, Katz directly threatened the civilian population of Gaza with utter destruction and devastation if they did not release the hostages and expel Hamas from Gaza. He added if the Palestinians did that, then they would be allowed to leave Gaza for another country. So forget the idea of, maybe they're going to leave, maybe they're not. The ethnic cleansing and the expulsion of them to the main options right now seem to be either Egypt, Syria, or Somaliland. That's the benevolent option. The other option is openly, we will kill you. That is being openly said by the top ministers and officials in Israel. And again, just so we're clear on the position that supposedly Hamas violated the ceasefire, this is from Haaretz, March 19th, 2025. Israel, not Hamas, is derailing the Gaza ceasefire and preventing the hostages' return. And obviously Haaretz is more aligned with the liberal opposition to Netanyahu, so it would make sense why they would put this forward. But it says, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu paid the asking price for Itamar Ben-Gvir's return to the government in advance, not out of his own pocket, of course, but with the blood of the 59 hostages whose fate could be sealed by the resumption of the war, which has already sealed the fate of hundreds of Palestinians, including women and children. On Thursday, Elijah Cohen, who was freed from Hamas captivity, called the renewed warfare a death sentence for the hostages, but that interests the prime minister less than his reward in the form of the homecoming of Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit party. So again, let this be clear, the liberal press in Israel that ostensibly is more against the war than than the Netanyahu stuff. Their only argument for why this is bad is that it might, kill the 59 hostages. Forget the hundreds of babies that have already been killed. Forget the destruction of the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital, which is one of the only places where real life-saving surgery and whatnot could be conducted in Palestine at all. So no care for that. Even the liberal Jews, the liberal Zionists, at the end of the day, the only blood that matters is Jewish blood, with Katz basically saying that, either they can leave or they can die. This is coming as, of course, big negotiations and big full court press from the U.S. is happening on all these relevant countries that could potentially take the Gazans. This is from the Jerusalem Post. It says, Egypt is willing to temporarily absorb 500,000 evacuated Gazans. Lebanese report. According to the report, the Gazans will be allocated a city in the north of the Sinai Peninsula. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi said that his country was ready to temporarily host 500,000 Gazans who would evacuate from the Gaza Strip, according to a Friday report by Hezbollah-affiliated Lebanese newspaper Al-Akhbar. According to the report, the Gazans would be allocated a city in the north of the Sinai Peninsula. The comment reportedly came during a conference held in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, on the situation in the Middle East, in which the Egyptian leader was present among other attendees. According to the report, the temporary relocation offer has raised concerns with Jordan, who has previously taken a strong stance against such a move. Obviously, Jordan already is a majority Palestinian state, so it makes sense why they're going to be against it. Al-Sisi, of course, is completely, on the leash of the Americans. They are the ones that prop up his regime. They're the ones that provide Egypt with the money to maintain, their country of almost 100 million people, despite its numerous ecological and economic, failings that it is currently undergoing. But of course, he emphasizes that it will be temporary. But so we kick them out into the Sinai Peninsula and they're just going to stay there for a little bit. Like, where are they eventually going to go? Are they eventually going to go back to Gaza? Clearly not. Half of it's getting annexed by Israel openly now. So at least half of them would have to stay, or else it would be, Gaza was already grossly overpopulated and densely populated. So Al-Sisi just has to say this so that, when they do come into the Sinai Peninsula and the Egyptian people do riot, he says it's only temporary. Then he can bide some time, shore up some more political support from the United States, shore up, some more soft power issues to prevent a Muslim Brotherhood-aligned government from overthrowing him, which would obviously not only want to see the Palestinians return home, but would also want to declare war on Israel, which, again, even Al-Sisi has almost been forced into doing that because of, this whole situation. And, if these Palestinians do enter the Sinai Peninsula, maybe he will be overthrown if they are able to filter into the rest of Egyptian society, which I'm sure he doesn't want to do. But the other big kahuna in this relocation game is Somaliland. This is also from the Jerusalem Post. Somaliland does not rule out absorption of Gaza residents. U.S. and Israeli officials reportedly reached out to officials of 3 East African governments to discuss the potential transfer of displaced Gazan Palestinians. The de facto African state of Somaliland does not rule out absorbing Gazan residents. The state's foreign minister, Abdirahman Dahir Adan, told Israel's public broadcaster, KAN, on Wednesday morning. Somaliland's foreign minister told KAN in a written statement, "We're open to discussion on any matter, but we do not want to speculate on matters that have not yet been discussed. All countries that are interested in discussing certain issues with us must first establish working relations with us and open diplomatic missions in Somaliland. The most important thing for us is to receive recognition after showing the world that we are a peace-loving, democratic country, which has been independent for 33 years. On March 14th, the AP reported that the U.S. and Israeli officials had reached out to officials of 3 East African governments to discuss the potential transfer of displaced Gazan Palestinians to their territories. The AP named these 3 states as Sudan, Somalia, and the breakaway region of Somaliland. So, again, the Somaliland question seems like it might actually be the most likely because the Somaliland government has the most to gain from taking these Gazan Palestinians. Again, Somalia is a Muslim country, but at a certain level, if I was a Gazan, I would not want to go live in Somalia. So I don't know what to say about that. But the situation obviously also has to, like I said, Sudan was mentioned, and the Sudanese junta continues to be victorious over the rapid support forces supported by the UAE. They recently retook the presidential palace in Khartoum. So, potentially when they settle down, they might benefit from a lot of Western support and, regime building and fortification if they are to take these Palestinians. But again, maybe the plan is to divide the population, to further kind of neutralize the Palestinians, even as a global anti-Semitic force, send 500,000 of them to Egypt, send 800,000 of them to Somaliland, send another 500,000 into Syria, because that's what they're talking about as well, normalizing more relations with the HTS, al-Jalani government to eventually resettle a lot of Gazans into the Sunni areas of Syria, which, again, Israel, considering that they are pushing into that buffer zone in southern Syria and creating this demilitarized zone, it's almost very similar to their situation with the Sinai, in Egypt, which again, if Palestinians are pushed into the Sinai, they could organize and then resist and launch attacks at Israel from there, which could prompt Israel to continue to expand the Greater Israel Project and actually retake the Sinai Peninsula that they had prior to 1967. So we have Israel obviously expanding its security buffer zone in Syria. We have them expanding into the West Bank. They've declared new war operations there as their Operation Iron Wall continues to displace tens of thousands of Palestinians there. And of course, they obviously are back into Gaza, and they're even in Lebanon, which this is from Jason Ditz. U.S. ultimatum to Lebanon: negotiate or we'll back further Israeli escalation. U.S. Deputy Envoy to the Middle East Morgan Ortagus has delivered an ultimatum to the Lebanese government demanding that they form committees to participate in direct negotiations with Israel by month's end or face an escalation of U.S.-backed Israeli attacks on Lebanese territory. The negotiations were announced a little over a week ago, and Lebanon has said no direct talks were happening. Israel has expressed hope that these talks would ultimately give way to normalization of Israeli-Lebanese relations. The U.S. wants to direct Lebanon participation and wants 3 committees specifically on the issues of active Israeli occupation of 5 military outposts inside Lebanon, the border itself, and the potential Israeli release of Lebanese prisoners. Since Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has promised Israel will continue to occupy those outposts irrespective of how the negotiations go, Lebanon has seen little interest in participating. Israel released a handful of prisoners when the U.S. first announced the talks as a sign of goodwill. The U.S. administration clearly wants to present these talks as a big diplomatic win in the region, but the threat of giving Israel permission to escalate military attacks against Lebanon probably doesn't mean much, since the U.S. has already given Israel a free hand to attack Lebanon throughout the ceasefire. And that is very true. We even have an announcement from President of Lebanon, Joseph Ayoun. He says Israel rejected all proposals submitted by Lebanon to evacuate the 5 hills, and it still holds a number of Lebanese prisoners. So there are 5 military positions across southern Lebanon that Israel continues to occupy, and Israel continues to renew strikes both on Hezbollah-aligned clans near the Syrian border, as well as other regions even not that far south in Lebanon, just general places where they see weapons are, and certain Hezbollah outposts. So Israel never really obeyed the ceasefire in Lebanon at all, just like they never really obeyed the ceasefire in Gaza, and just like they escalated in the West Bank, despite realizing how hypocritical it is to use the quote-unquote Gaza ceasefire as an opportunity to reshuffle your military players back into the West Bank where you really want to do all of your work. And, speaking of the Syria situation, this is from Le Monde. Israel says it struck 2 military bases in central Syria, including one in Palmyra. The Israeli military said on Friday, March 21st, that it had struck 2 military bases in central Syria, including one in Palmyra, after a war monitor reported that the airbase in the city had been targeted. A short while ago, the IDF struck military strategic capabilities that remained at the Syrian military base of Tadmor and T4. The Israeli military said in a statement referring to the bases in Palmyra and another 50 kilometers west of the city. Earlier, the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said Israeli warplanes targeted the Palmyra military airport. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has demanded the demilitarization of southern Syria and said his country will not tolerate the presence of forces from the new authorities south of the capital, Damascus. So, again, Greater Israel is encompassing more and more of southern Syria every day. But that was a lot. Dimitri, before we talk about the Houthis in Iran, I guess, what are your thoughts on both the expulsions in Gaza, the escalations in Lebanon and Syria, and just the overall situation in Israel?
Yeah, well, I think the Lebanese situation is very curious because, as we said before, Israel's goal, I believe, is to disarm its immediate neighbors, of course, those in complete adjacency to it. That is, of course, Jordan is weakened or brought off, Egypt is brought off, and of course has internal struggles, the ever-present threat of an Islamic Brotherhood takeover, which again, Islamic Brotherhood in and of itself is a very paramasonic, you can say, organization that potentially has ties to the British Crown as well as Qatar. These very, you can almost say Philo-Semitic roots, which again, we don't want to go too deep into conspiracies, but the origins of Hamas, I think, are somewhat questionable, and perhaps we could dig deeper into that in the future if there are. But the 5 particular areas, if you have a look on a map of Lebanon, 3 of them are in the south that Israel controls, and 2 are actually in the east. The 2 in the east are adjacent to the Golan Heights, and some of these areas controlled the so-called buffer territories of southern Syria. So these 2 particular areas, of course, one of them touching the Litani River, will most likely never be given up by Israel at this point. And President Joseph Aoun, the new president of Lebanon, despite the fact that he does have popular support, I don't think he's willing to go against the Hezbollah really strong minority in Lebanon, because he understands that Israel is, of course, it's not fighting for regional peace, it's fighting for Israeli domination. Israel would be happy if Lebanon went into another civil war amongst themselves, the Sunnis, the Shias, the Maronites, etc., if they begin fighting amongst themselves in Lebanon, Israel will be much happier, I think, given the current situation. It'll mean that Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy, will of course not intimidate the Israelis living in the north, and they will of course give Israel the complete green light in terms of expanding potentially further into Syria, and again, maybe even taking the West Bank without Hezbollah overreacting to the fact that Sunni Muslims are being bullied in Palestinian territories. Because remember, Hezbollah and Sheikh Nasrallah, they only reacted in late 2023 to Israel's occupation of Gaza and their sort of response to October 7th, and Israel's perhaps overextension and its overuse of military technology against Hamas and against the civilians of Palestine. So we have to understand that Hezbollah actually does care for sort of all Muslims despite their background. And Israel is really not happy. They're not happy about this sort of pan-Islamic solidarity, and I think they want to break that, potentially through the commencement of a civil war. So they'll be pressuring President Joseph Aoun in Lebanon to act against Hezbollah south of the Litani River, to disarm these Hezbollah bases. And of course, I think the president of Lebanon is not an idiot. Despite the fact that he does have certain questionable ties politically, I think he understands this will be the end of his political career, and he'll be marked off as a sort of Gorbachev figure if he allows for Lebanon's destabilization to take place under his presidency. That would be completely insane. So Israel, of course, holds the high ground, literally and geographically speaking, in the Golan Heights, and still holds all of these positions. I think Netanyahu as well, as long as he's in power, he understands that he needs to keep a finger on the pulse in terms of politically. The military still supports him. They think that he's sort of this warlord type leader. All of these successes that he's experienced, the so-called success. Of course, me and you, Conrad, we don't see the depths of thousands, tens of thousands of civilians as a military success by any stretch, for very vague reasons. Of course, Netanyahu has already proposed that Israel is simply seeking out its interests in both Syria, Lebanon, and it will most likely keep its forces there for as long as possible. So very concerning, I think. And the Houthi reaction was probably the most admirable thing. They literally stuck to their words, which is so rare in today's political and even geopolitical reality. In international relations, as we saw in December, Russia abandoning the Dr. Assad government, in the Syrian Arab army, of course, falling apart, many betrayals, many cases of treason, and suddenly Ansar Allah, which is not even adjacent or anywhere near the Palestinians, begins again, bombing and threatening ships which are traveling through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal. And again, keeping to their word. This is most likely one of the most impressive political moves we've seen recently. And again, we're not saying that, of course, warfare is something admirable, but I think this particular idea that, look, if Israel is going to be genociding civilian populations, Ansar Allah will stand by their Muslim brothers just to the north, and they will defend them. And this is what probably all the Arab Sunni countries should have done early on, after October 7th, after Israel, of course, showed that they're willing to commit literal genocide against the Palestinians. And Ansar Allah at the moment, I mean, generally speaking, Conrad, if we look at the full spectrum of their blockade of the Red Sea, their bombardment of these trading vessels, the death toll has been very minimal thus far. They've killed somewhere between 3 and 5 people. And these were mainly because the drones have exploded and these explosions have caused deaths. They've sunk 2 vessels. They've damaged over 100 vessels. Yes, probably immeasurable economic damages to world trade. And in particular, as you said off air, the majority of that damage has been done to Israel, Israeli imports and exports, which of course was probably the goal in the first place, because Israel is the aggressor country from the Muslim perspective. And naturally speaking, Ansar Allah has received a lot more than it actually dealt in terms of losses, because the America and Donald J. Trump have officially, you can almost say, declared war on Yemen, and they've killed between 50 and 100 Yemeni Houthis, so Ansar Allah members and some civilians as well, in the capital city of Western Yemen called Sana'a, as well as the port of Hodeidah, which is adjacent to the Red Sea. This is a very important port. This is arguably where the Houthis are launching their drones from. And of course, Trump's 2 aircraft carriers carried out a lot of these sorties. There were between 50 and 100 sorties carried out at the beginning of this week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. The Houthis, of course, have experienced enormous losses to some of their facilities on the outskirts of Sana'a, as well as some of those northern provinces which are adjacent to Saudi Arabia. And what was the response, Conrad? Did the Sunni Houthis proclaim that, look, we surrender, we will stop, of course, blockading port? No. Literally less than 24 hours ago, and we're recording on the 21st of March, the Houthis began bombing Israel itself. Long-range missiles, and again, these missiles are not too deadly, they're not hypersonic by any stretch of the imagination. It's not these Oryashniks that Russia has. But the missiles really caused havoc, and they made the Iron Dome work over time. They've aimed at Haifa, Jerusalem, in particular Western Jerusalem. They aimed at Tel Aviv, of course, and all these other Jewish settlements. And we saw, of course, crazy footage. The Israelis, again, are in a state of panic, especially after the short ceasefire that took place at the beginning of the year. I think a lot of the Israeli civilian population kind of believe that perhaps even under the reign of the warlord Netanyahu, perhaps there would be a temporary peace. But the Houthis have given them a real wake-up call that, look, if you'll be genociding Palestinians again, we're not going to stand by and just watch. We're going to act. And so it's quite impressive that despite the fact that literally there are 3 aircraft carriers pointing all their planes and all their weapons at the Houthis are not giving up. So that's Harry Truman, of course, the Carl Vinson, and the British aircraft carrier Prince of Wales also there, as well as some other British frigates, battleships, and French battleships and frigates as well. So there's an entire navy, probably bigger than the entire Turkish navy, located in the Red Sea fighting against the Yemenis Houthis, and they're not giving up. And naturally, Saudi Arabia is always a potential aggressor from the north that could always invade Yemen. And we know Saudi Arabia did lose a war against the Yemenis Houthis just over a decade ago, but I think in terms of territorial expansion, this would be a natural expansion point for those Gulf countries, which are deeply sort of philo-Semitic. And I'm sure if they received funding from the US, Trump's administration is really trying to save money, but if they wanted to pay the Gulf states to invade Yemen, I think the Yemenis would probably see another invading force coming from the north, just like in decades past. So big concerns. And of course, Ansar Allah are really proving themselves to be some of the most consistent allies of the Palestinians that we've seen, which I think is impressive. Even though me and you, Conrad, we're not Muslims, we can appreciate the fact that, look, at least someone is standing up for the Muslim majority of Palestinians. And hopefully in the future, if there is an Orthodox country which is in danger, the Orthodox neighbors of that state, or sort of neighbors across the sea somewhere, perhaps if there's a war in Georgia or Georgia is attacked by Azerbaijan, I'm hoping a country like Greece would perhaps support it, or Russia. You'd hope that there'd be some solidarity of this particular kind. So I think generally speaking, what we see today is a big escalation in the Red Sea zone, huge escalation in the Levant. Things are moving very quickly. And of course, Trump officially sort of declaring himself not really a peacetime president. He's very much a war president. And this, of course, flies in the face of many things that he said during his electoral campaign. But me and you, Conrad, we did discuss the election very deeply last year, just moving even prior to his inauguration, prior to the entire election campaign, when we knew that Trump would first and foremost support the interests of Israel in the Middle East. Unfortunately, no matter what kind of black swan events could come out of it, potentially the downing of an aircraft carrier, an American frigate, a battleship, the lives of American sailors and Navy personnel being at risk, I think Trump is not concerned about that too much. I think his primary interest is to support Israel, America's so-called greatest ally in the region. And Trump doesn't want to be the president that sees Israel fall, I think. And this may be due to his political, familial connections, maybe some of the sponsors, people who've given money to him during his campaign. And nevertheless, I think this reality still exists. So Trump really hasn't changed from his first presidency. And the overarching theme of a potential future Iranian, Israeli, as well as US war is looming overhead.
That was very well said. Of course, Trump now is this wartime president. It's another, again, I don't need to every week update everybody on the fact that so far Trump has, in his first term, deported less illegal immigrants than Joe Biden's monthly deportation average. So even putting that aside, Trump betrayed another campaign promise by effectively starting a new war. And he's saying, oh, it's not a war, it's not a ground war, it's a sustained air campaign, and indefinitely sustained air campaign. But according to Ansar Allah, the Houthis, it is a war. They say that we are now at war with the United States. And this is from Anti-War. Yemen's Saba news agency reported 4 U.S. airstrikes in the Hodeidah province, which is located on the Red Sea. It's unclear if there were any casualties in the latest U.S. strikes. A day earlier, U.S. strikes hit a residential area in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, reportedly wounding 7 women and 2 children. The U.S. airstrikes were reported around the same time the Israeli military said that it intercepted a missile launched from Yemen, the second Houthi attack within a day. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, restarted missile attacks on Israel after the Israeli military resumed its massive bombing campaign on the Gaza Strip, massacring hundreds of Palestinians. According to the Israeli news site Ynet, the U.S. has asked Israel not to respond to the Houthis' attacks and urged that Israel leave the response to the U.S. military. While U.S. officials have framed the bombing campaign in Yemen as a way to protect the U.S. military and American shipping, it was really launched in response to the Houthis saying they would reimpose its blockade on Israeli shipping over Israel imposing a total blockade on Gaza, a major violation of the ceasefire deal signed in January. The Houthis had ceased their attacks once the Gaza ceasefire went into effect on January 19th and had not launched any until after the U.S. restarted its bombing campaign on Saturday, March 15th. The first barrage of U.S. airstrikes killed 53 people in Yemen, including women and children. Since then, the Houthis have claimed several attacks on the U.S. aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman, which U.S. officials have downplayed, saying they were easily intercepted. President Trump is blaming the Houthis' attacks on Iran, even though U.S. officials have acknowledged that Ansar Allah acts independently and is unlikely to take orders from Tehran. The Houthis have said they would not dial down operations in response to U.S. military pressure or appeals from Iran. So, again, obviously, there's a high death toll in Yemen. There's been huge rallies in support of the Palestinians, in support of Ansar Allah's escalation. And al-Houthi himself, the leader of the Houthis, he is still safe, but many of his top lieutenants and deputies have been killed in these strikes. They are attempting to totally decapitate the Yemeni regime, which ultimately would, I don't know how they plan on filling that power vacuum if the UAE, Saudi-backed proxies even have the wherewithal. I mean, the vast majority of these Yemenis in this region are in favor of the Houthis. They are these fiver Shiites, which is, people call it the Sunnism of Shiism, but it is still Shiism nonetheless. And it seems that the big news story here isn't just the, sustained attack. Obviously, the Harry S. Truman is in the Red Sea, but so are two other carrier strike groups now. So the likelihood of a false flag that fully drags the U.S. into the war is very high. But it's that Trump said that we are now basically viewing all Houthi attacks as direct Iranian attacks. And let's say one of the Houthis' missiles strikes the Harry Truman or one of these aircraft carriers. Maybe it sinks, maybe it gets damaged, maybe U.S. servicemen die. Well, apparently that's going to be considered directly an Iranian attack on America. So that's going to be, the escalation here is frightening, and people are going to be like, oh, nothing ever happens. This is fine. Just destroy the Houthis. Who cares about them? It's like, well, instead of escalating a complicated military operation and deploying hundreds of U.S. servicemen on these complex carrier strike group systems and deploying some of our top aircraft, how about we just tell Israel to stop genociding the Gazans? How about we just stop giving Israel the bombs that they use to drop on Palestinian families? How about we tell Israel to stop expanding its Greater Israel project and come to the negotiating table and actually behave like a reasonable state. And of course, we're going to get into the rogue nature of Israel's military and Israel's nuclear program very soon here. But again, you talk about October 7th, you talk about, what was supposed to happen here. And the Houthis, being effectively a sub-state actor, are the only ones that have actually stepped up to the plate. Iran is sort of playing this game. They're farther away. They've done some strikes, but Hezbollah has been destroyed. Hamas has effectively been destroyed. Assad has fallen. The U.S. is openly asking the Iraqi government to completely dismantle and take down the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are, the Shiite Iranian proxy that operates in Iraq, that have also launched attacks on Israel and U.S. bases in the region in response to the Gaza genocide. But in light of all of this, of course, one of the big things that happened is that the Netanyahu government has voted unanimously to end Ronen Bar's term as the Shin Bet chief. Shin Bet, of course, is the Israeli domestic intelligence operation, the equivalent to the FBI, whereas, Mossad is the equivalent to their CIA. This says the government has voted unanimously to end Ronen Bar's term as Shin Bet chief, the prime minister's office announced on a statement early Friday morning. Bar will end his role in April 10th, or when a new Shin Bet chief is appointed, whichever comes first. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu first said he would put forward to the cabinet the proposal to fire Bar some 18 months before his term expires Sunday night. And this is all in the midst of this Netanyahu scandal. Of course, Netanyahu skips most of his court hearings. But the big thing, apparently, that these court hearings with Netanyahu have turned into is about this thing called Qatar Gate, which is kind of an investigation into Netanyahu's connections with Qatar. This says the decision was made in a clear conflict of interest and based on extraneous considerations that are not in line with the state's best interests and security. The decision to dismiss the Shin Bet chief is a black moment in the history of Israeli democracy. This is a transparent attempt to torpedo the Qatar Gate investigation and prevent the truth from being revealed about the dangerous ties between members of the prime minister's office, that's Netanyahu, and Qatar, Hamas's main funder. And that's interesting because, as we just said, the Houthis being the only ones that have really stepped up to the plate, all October 7th has done besides that is give Israel a carte blanche license to basically wipe out all of Iran's proxies, to completely dismantle the axis of resistance, grow its territory the most substantially it has in a very, very long time. So the question becomes, how true are these accusations about Netanyahu and Hamas? We know the Netanyahu government obviously propped up Hamas against the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was a more secular Arab nationalist Palestinian resistance group that was their main enemy for, most of the 20th century and the other wars that Israel has fought against its neighbors and against the Palestinians. So if October 7th has been nothing more than a pretty much total victory for Israel and Netanyahu's war aims, and we obviously know that Qatar has been the main connection there, well, think about, despite the fact that Qatar hosts Hamas and they publish Al Jazeera and all these sorts of things, and that they did likely contribute to the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. Well, they're right, it is. They worked with Israel and Turkey to collapse the Assad regime. They clearly either didn't discourage or encouraged Hamas to launch the October 7th attack, which led to Israel doing all of these things. And Qatar itself has done nothing. Qatar hates Iran. They have been an open enemy of the main supporter of the Palestinian resistance. So it all starts to come together, if you understand what I'm saying here. The getting rid of this guy who might have been able to expose Netanyahu's connections with these people, again, the liberal opposition is still Zionist, but it seems that they might be more open to putting Fatah back in power and potentially giving the Palestinian Authority its old 1967 borders or something. Whereas obviously Netanyahu completely he brought Ben Gvir back into his government. The radical settlers and religious Zionists are very pleased, and they're clearly going to be pushing for total Palestinian death, total greater Israel, complete third temple levels of rebuilding a Jewish state, and that is exactly what we are witnessing right now. But when it comes to the situation, of course, with the Houthis, who, as I just described, potentially because of the actions of Qatar and the Israeli government, they're the only ones that are able to act sort of unilaterally against Israel. This is very much tied in with the latest letter that Trump sent to the Iranian supreme leader. And this is from Kyle Anzalone. During an address on the Persian New Year, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei responded to President Donald Trump's recent threats to attack Iran. He said on Thursday, the U.S. and others must know that if they commit any malicious act against the Iranian nation, they will receive a severe blow. Trump has threatened Iran multiple times in recent weeks. Let nobody be fooled. The hundreds of attacks being made by Houthi, the sinister mobsters and thugs based in Yemen, who are hated by the Yemeni people, all emanate from and are created by Iran. Any further attack or retaliation by the Houthis will be met with great force, and there's no guarantee that that force will stop there, Trump wrote on Truth Social earlier this week. Khamenei argued that Tehran does not control the Houthis, also known by their formal title Ansar Allah. Why do you label them as proxies? The people of Yemen and the resistance centers in the region have an inner motive to stand against the Zionists, and the Islamic Republic of Iran does not need proxies. Our stance is clear, and so is theirs, he explained. Additionally, Trump sent a letter to Khamenei urging Tehran to agree to a new nuclear deal within 2 months. Axios reporter Barak Ravid wrote that if Iran does not negotiate, the chances of U.S. or Israeli military action against Iran's nuclear facilities would dramatically increase. Barak Ravid is a former Mossad agent, by the way, so he would know. Khamenei rejected talks with Trump because he destroyed the 2015 Iran nuclear deal during his first administration. So why do we refuse to negotiate? This same person tore up the JCPOA, he said last week. How can we negotiate with this person? In negotiations, one must be sure that the other party will fulfill their commitments. When we know that they will not keep their word, what's the point? The Ayatollah doubled down on that position during Thursday's speech, saying the U.S. must know that when facing Iran, threats will never achieve anything. Prior to Trump's second term, Axios reported that military action against Iran's nuclear facilities would be a real possibility under the new administration. The Pentagon is currently updating its war plans for Iran, and top U.S. and Israeli officials are meeting this week to discuss what will happen if Tehran does not come to an agreement. And of course, we've heard that the U.S. and Israel have tried to drag Russia into this. Russia has even openly said that we agree that Iran cannot be allowed to destroy Israel with a nuke. And, basically buying into this narrative that the Iranian nuclear sites are designed to create weapons. They are designed to weaponize enriched uranium and plutonium, create a nuclear weapon that would destroy Israel. And the Israelis love it if everybody believes that, because that gives them license to drag their attack dog, that is the United States, into a very hot third world war in what is one of the most mountainous countries in the world, Iran, which, again, that would require a draft in the United States. This would require extensive collaboration between pretty much all Western powers. It would give China a window of opportunity in Taiwan, and it would, of course, bring Russia in, because Russia and then its best friend Belarus have alliances, Belarus specifically a military alliance, with Iran. So Russia, I think, needs to be doing more to rein in Israel, unless they foolishly still don't understand the place of world Jewry in all of this. But I think this is an interesting development in relation to the fact that the JFK files just dropped. And for anybody that isn't aware, I'm sure everybody listens to the show, we've already said that, Jews and Israel killed JFK. But, some of these revelations, which again, were very surprising, Trump did release the full, collection of the JFK files. And a lot of us thought that anything referencing Israel or Jews would be blacked out. In fact, in the files was released, there was a request from the CIA to pretty much censor everything that has to do with Israel. But some of the gems, and again, autists are still filtering through this. I've read, a decent amount of what I can, but one of the big lines. This is one of the most kind of, I don't want to say iconic, but sort of on the nose things that was said. This was part of a document that was declassified. It says this is from somebody that was questioned in these committees. This is from somebody that had an informant listening to them. And they said that we now have plenty of money. Our new backers are Jews. As soon as we or they take care of Kennedy, and then it goes on to explain what they'll have done. So again, the CIA, there was sort of, it's understood there's sort of a rogue element within the CIA that was very much tied in with Israel, were behind this assassination, of course, in conjunction likely with Lyndon Johnson, who was the immediate political benefactor who became the president. And remember with Lyndon Johnson, when the USS Liberty situation happened and people asked him to, come out and expose this and call out Israel, he said, I will not release anything or do anything that will embarrass my ally Israel. And I think some people have even questioned if Lyndon Johnson is a sort of crypto Jew. I'm not going to make any accusations there, but an intelligence subject that was documented and had his quotes documented in these classified documents as well. He said, Israel is no good. Israel was behind the JFK assassination. And this was in a document that was just declassified. But as far as sort of smoking guns and full narrative revelation, I think the most important thing was the revelations about CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton, who was Israel's guy in the CIA. And it's understood that he was basically transferring plutonium, other nuclear-related intelligence, and all sorts of equipment that basically allowed Israel to create its secret, illegal nuclear arsenal that it still currently uses to threaten the world with the Samson option, that it still currently uses to help rattle the saber against Iran. And the U.S., openly hostile towards Iran, who, again, the Ayatollah who Trump is dealing with here has a religious fatwa against nuclear weapons. That is literally what he has on the books. Yet we're going to be threatening them with strikes under this auspice that they are imminently about to strike Israel. Meanwhile, Israel with 59, 100 plus nuclear weapons openly in the Middle East illegally, and we just do whatever they want. We just let them have their way, that we let them drag us around. And, that's exactly what's happening. So, of course, I think a lot of people, Glenn Beck, Ben Shapiro, others are like, it's not about who did it. It's really about the deep state, just this general idea. Whereas obviously we know that Israel has infiltrated our most critical intelligence capabilities, worked with organized crime, about Mo Dalitz, these other Jewish mobsters that operated within Dallas. Of course, Jack Rubenstein was the Jewish mobster that ended up killing Lee Harvey Oswald. So the whole cover-up was sort of involved the Jewish mob and everything like that. So all of these people, these criminal enterprises, international ethno-religious supremacist cult had infiltrated our intelligence apparatus at the highest levels and killed a president. And of course, Kennedy was interested in nuclear disarmament for Israel, preventing them from getting the bomb. He also supported Palestinian right to return. And of course, RFK, his brother, was also going to follow this legacy, was going to investigate, the true perpetrators of, his brother's assassination. Meanwhile, it was some Jewish Mossad-affiliated person was the one that told him to go out from his rally a certain way, which led him right into the gun of his assassin. So, of course, the murder of RFK is also implicated in all of this. So, potentially we might be having someone on this week to break all this down on an ether hour. We'll see, can't make any promises. But yeah, Dimitri, I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on the Iran situation, these potential strikes, as well as, the JFK files before we talk about what's going on in Turkey.
Yeah, I think the JFK conspiracy for Americans is essentially the equivalent of maybe the Russian Revolution, because it's the first time really that there's been such an event. It is the first 9/11 in some ways, and it's a real gateway towards understanding exactly that there are these deep state actors within America, but also external to America, acting in conjunction, sort of these desperate groups essentially attempting to subvert power structure. And perhaps even on the surface, they don't seem to be aligned. For example, the mob, the sort of East Coast mafia, the Dallas mafia. But at the same time, you look behind the scenes and it seems to be the same noses, the same sort of personalities controlling everything, or at least involved. They have their sort of fingers in these various pies and these various pie shops. And this perhaps is really a good opportunity. The fact that the JFK files have been unlocked and sort of available to the public now, there's a lot of discourse about it. It'll give the opportunity for people like Candace Owens, Ian Carroll to maybe red pill some folks who maybe aren't familiar with this sort of subject matter, because some heavy-hitting subject matter topics in this particular realm, Conrad, the Russian Revolution, for example, the Second World War, maybe they are too distant in time. The JFK, there are still people who were alive, who were present, who were sort of in the 80s. They remember it very, very well. They remember exactly what happened during those particular days. And now, with this additional information provided and with these news sources uncovering all these facts, they can finally look back at those events and kind of assess them in a different fashion. And there is some explanation, of course, that this was essentially just an internal coup amongst Americans, an internal conspiracy theory. But I think it goes far beyond that. It's just the singular example of where Jewish collaborators, along with Shabbos Goy on the inside, are working towards one particular goal. It is sort of like the first French revolutionary moment in American history. Of course, despite the 1913 establishment of the Federal Reserve, which I think happened more or less in the shadows and did not have that many Americans protesting it in the open, and 9/11 being that culminating event which led America to these disastrous, very pricey wars in the 21st century, which people can follow up on. And I mean, they all tie to the same sort of new terroristic state actor in the Middle East. So I think it's a very interesting opportunity, and hopefully more Americans, especially those unaware of these conspiracies, really begin looking into them. But one of these sort of conspiracies was, of course, the fall of Syria. So if we kind of return to the subject of the Middle East, where all of these ties connect, that the position of Syria between Iran and Israel, we kind of begin to understand why Israel needed Syria to fall and what exactly Russia's role was in all of this. And recent news is, of course, not very comforting for us, those fans of Russia's Orthodox Christian rebirth, because we do see President Vladimir Putin, for example, through his press secretary Peskov, confirming, and I quote, Russia's continuing readiness to develop practical cooperation with the Syrian leadership on a whole range of issues on the bilateral agenda in order to strengthen traditionally friendly Russian-Syrian relations. This includes stabilization of the situation in the country as soon as possible, to strengthen sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. So what exactly does this mean? So the new HDS Syrian oppositionary government, which is now in power, is completely legitimate from the Russian perspective. Complete change of tune, almost as if the Russian leadership, the Russian foreign ministry, has completely changed their beat in relation to these Islamic terror groups. Very strange, unfortunate, and it kind of is thrown in the face of this narrative that the Russians were in the Middle East, in Syria, to defend the Christians against al-Qaeda and ISIS. Well, I'll tell you what, former members of al-Qaeda and ISIS are now in power. And yes, there is currently more or less a peaceful situation, well, you can say relatively speaking, in the western territories of Syria adjacent to the Mediterranean. But that is only because literally Elon Musk, as well as Marco Rubio and other major American politicians, began tweeting, and there were press conferences regarding this particular issue, the massacring of the Alawites, the Sunnis, Shias, and of course Christians in West Syria. So that has of course calmed down. Al-Shara al-Jalani is playing this new sort of peacekeeper in Syria, of course. Now that the Kurdish situation has also died down, suddenly the Russians are kind of opening their doors to these new Syrian delegates. And the real question, of course, will arise as to what will happen to Bashar al-Assad. Will the Russians send him over? I think we kind of discuss this almost every week, because I think the future of Russian foreign policy really kind of hinges on this particular person and his family as to how Russia will treat them. So it's very interesting, and we'll keep observing the news related to him. But in terms of Iran, I think there is a big division within Iran. As you said, IRGC is, I think, very strongly anti-Israel. There is, of course, the Iranian political class, the bureaucrats, especially the elected elites, with President Dr. Pezeshkian. They're, of course, more eager to sort of normalize relations like with the Democrat Obama administration almost a decade ago. And I think the lack of Sheikh Raisi, the former president of Iran, his alignment with Ali Khamenei, I think will be missed, because now Iran very much is divided as to what they will do. And Iran naturally still does not want to see itself as the future Iraq, the future Afghanistan, this big battlefield that will be bombed from range by both the Gulf states and Israel, and maybe even the American aircraft carriers, which again, swimming like sharks, they can smell the blood in the water very, very close to the Iranian shores. So that's all very concerning. And Iran also understands its relationship to its major BRICS neighbors. For example, Iran, of course, provides 60% of the gas and oil to China. It provides these massive energy resources to its BRICS ally in China. It provides military resources and equipment, especially in relation to drones, as well as clothing, to Russia. So it's kind of in this position that, well, if Iran is taken out, this will benefit America both on the east and oriental front, as well as in the north in Europe. And Iran understands that. They understand they're in the crosshairs, which is why I think the political elite is very much split on how they should handle this nuclear energy discourse. So hopefully Iran really manages to balance its approach out. It cannot be super hawkish right now, because they will be blamed for anything that the Houthis do wrong, so to speak. And again, the Houthis doing something wrong is very subjective, because naturally the Houthis simply want to seek Palestinian freedom and well-being here. But again, Donald J. Trump has made it very clear, especially to normie Americans, that the Houthis are this renegade faction backed by Iran that needs to be taken out. And as you said, Conrad, this has huge implications for a future escalation that will potentially lead to a world war. And all of this is happening in the Middle East, right? This general center, eastern, southern Middle Eastern area, whilst there are insane protests happening, of course, in the second Rome, in the city of Istanbul. There are massive protests in Ankara. There are big protests as, of course, the Turkish people are essentially revolting, at least the young liberal Turks, those who want Turkey to be more democratic, more like Europe. Perhaps they want Turkey to join the European Union in some way. They were all protesting against the mayor, against the imprisonment that took place just a few days ago on the 19th of March of the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu. And İmamoğlu is a very interesting character. He's in some ways reminds us of the 2023 opposition to Erdogan, Kılıçdaroğlu, because he's a Kemalist, which means that this is a very, shall we say, left-wing, in a Turkish context, very left-wing, very Masonic, very liberal faction of Turkish nationalists. They are still nationalistic in a Turkish sense, but they do not want Turkey to become more Islamic. Whereas Erdogan, it does seem like his alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood behind the scenes with Qatar, with some of these big factions now, of course, HTS in Syria, essentially like a fiefdom of the Turkish foreign policy. Erdogan really doesn't want to descend into a full liberal paradigm. And so he's been fighting off these Kemalists for quite a while, politically speaking. And I find it in some ways, it's very Putin-esque in the way he took the mayor of Istanbul and imprisoned him. There was, of course, corruption charges that were laid on both İmamoğlu as well as over 100 people. And when his arrest took place, there was also a very interesting rescindment of both his Bachelor of Arts degree as well as his Master of Arts degree from the Istanbul University, of which the mayor of Istanbul attended and which he graduated from. So the university system, it appears in Turkey, is very much, well, obviously it's state controlled to the point where a bureaucrat, a politician like Erdogan could literally call the university up and say, look, we're going to recall this degree on some of these nuances that perhaps are related to the mayor's graduation. And in Turkey, there is a law on the books that you cannot be an elected politician without an appropriate university degree. So it's very interesting how they handled this. Now, the Turkish youth, it appears, are very much sustained in their protest. There are literally speeches playing on loudspeakers of İmamoğlu. He's apparently a very charismatic figure in Turkey. Not just is he a nationalist, but he also has this sort of liberal European angle, which I think the youth are very attracted to. And at the same time, we do know from the prophecies, Conrad, that when Erdogan does fall and say these Kemalists do take over, the Kemalists are very famous in the Balkans, in Turkey in general, for their very anti-Greek, anti-Armenian stances. Like, these are the people responsible mainly for the infamous Armenian genocide, which took place during and just after the First World War. So the Kemalists are not these cozy left-wingers, which we tend to associate liberalism with. These are aggressive, atheistic, almost Bolshevik-like. And the Ataturk government in the early 20th century was strongly allied to the Bolsheviks. In fact, a lot of the Russian Tsarist gold, the so-called mysterious Tsarist gold that went missing, a portion of it actually went to support the Ataturk government. So Kemal Ataturk and Kemalism very much hinges on this Freemasonic model of what Turkey should look like. So in fact, if Erdogan, if this particular Maidan does turn into something, and, we may see maybe a much faster fulfillment of the prophecies than what we even predicted, Conrad, because Turkey will be thrown into a state of disarray, and perhaps there will be heightened tensions with Turkish neighbors such as Armenia, of course, and Armenia is already not on a very equal playing field with its neighbor Azerbaijan, and of course Greece, the disputes over the Greek islands, etc., all kinds of issues happening there in both countries are, of course, rearming, purchasing aircraft, as well as refurbishing their navies. And a good historical comparison to all of this is, and perhaps this is even a strike from the West, perhaps the West is banking on the fact that the Kemalists coming to power will be more obedient rather than this Erdogan sort of new caliphate emir of Turkey model. A good historical analogy would be the French de Gaulle government, which was very Western, but at the same time highly conservative. So if you look at French history, between 1965 and 1967, President de Gaulle of France was actually trading US dollars for literal gold with America. And French ships would land on the east coast of America, literally buy gold with US dollars and bring them back to France, which is why France actually has quite a large gold reserve because of those 1960s. This, as you can imagine, triggered the American bankers, the American deep state. And in 1968, there were huge liberal, almost Kemalist type protests against de Gaulle's government in France. And since 1968 and 1969, when President de Gaulle resigned, France went on this downward spiral into hyperliberalism, which we see today with France essentially being incredibly culturally enriched and sort of mass migrated. France is really descending into this abyss of neoliberalism. And that's since those 1960s years. So perhaps even President de Gaulle, who was very Western in his mindset, but he's still quite a conservative figure, almost dictatorial, very powerful French president, and Erdogan, a very powerful Turkish president. Maybe the West is saying, well, look, this guy might have a bit too much independence, similar to how Putin was very much a Yeltsin guy. Once he came into power, of course, he needed to be removed. So the oligarchs tried to displace him through electoral machinations, through running people like Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky against him in the media, etc. And so the West, I think, is very cautious of these powerful, semi-independent figures rising to power in these former controlled areas such as Turkey, of course, France, etc., and Russia. So I think that particular analogy is very apt. So we don't know who's behind this Maidan. Is it just a completely organic Kemalist protest, or perhaps are there maybe Western, like Greta Thunberg type figures, again, arriving in Turkey and sort of keeping Erdogan tense, very much sort of showing him that, look, you may have all this success in Syria, but you're still a member of NATO. You're still supposed to toe our line in Russia and Ukraine, or else your presidency will come to an end, because Turkey, unfortunately, is suffering from hyperinflation right now. It's not economically doing too well, and geopolitical successes will not keep the very consumerist liberal youth happy. So I think Turkey is undergoing some extreme changes right now, Conrad. It'll be very interesting to see exactly where these Istanbul, Constantinople, and Ankara protests go throughout the next week.
Now, you mentioned the Armenian genocide. We can never forget that, hundreds of thousands of Pontic Greek Orthodox Christians were also killed at the same time. So I always refer to it as the Armenian Greek genocide. But of course, the main reason this is happening, the main reason that this is from the AP on Wednesday, dozens of police officers raided the residence of Ekrem İmamoğlu around dawn and detained him for questioning as part of investigations into alleged corruption and terror links. So there was a sort of pre-dawn raid, this very kind of show of force thing from Erdogan. And the reason that he has initiated this sort of assault on his opposition is because polls show that he is going to lose this next election when it is eventually called, when, Erdogan, who doesn't seem to have a very powerful, much like Putin, doesn't seem to have a very publicly visible, charismatic successor to carry on his, neo-Ottoman political Islamist that his Justice Party, has embarked upon. They've now decided that it's worth it to basically openly display authoritarian tendencies, openly go against the public, openly invite foreign intervention, but openly invite foreign critique, because it's worth it to not lose to İmamoğlu. They think that at this point, if they just had an election, they would lose, so they need to actually try to derail him. And of course, the important part about the whole degree thing, where they've attempted to rescind his degree from University of Istanbul on account that his transfer from a university in northern Cyprus was invalid, is because only degree holders, only people that went to university can become the president of Turkey. So not only are they going after him for terrorism, for supposedly collaborating with the PKK and others, but they're trying to make him not even capable of being elected, even if he does somehow skirt these charges. And again, he's been accused of working with PKK and the Kurds for the longest time, because his CHP party, which was formerly led by Kılıçdaroğlu, who lost to Erdogan, they have often, sought support from Kurds who are obviously very against Erdogan, very against, the super Islamist nationalist Turkish group. I mean, Erdogan is currently, waging war against the SDF in Syria. I'm going to get to that in a second. But the simple fact that, he thought that this was worth it to actually make this bold move and invite these massive protests. I mean, they're not just in Ankara and Istanbul. They're in Trebizond. They're in eastern Turkey. They're, down on the southern coast. I'm wondering if there may even be protests in northern Cyprus. I'll have to see what's going on with that. But no, this is quite the big political moment. As far as World War Now goes, this is the biggest story that I've been keeping up with this week. A lot of people have been posting, looks like Erdogan is about to fall. Who could have seen this coming? And I, of course, quote tweeted it with the image of myself with Metropolitan Neophytos, because we know that in many ways, the two big events that we're kind of waiting to kick a lot of this off are, of course, the fall of Erdogan and the strikes on Iran's nuclear capabilities by Israel. And everyone I've talked to have said that the Erdogan falling thing is likely to happen first. And people have told me, a lot of people in Greece are talking about this. It does seem that this could be, the one. And many people have been like, no, Erdogan is powerful. Turkey is ascendant. How is he going to fall? But again, think about why other powers might want this to happen. Let's say there is already a firm plan in place for striking Iran's nuclear capabilities, for risking a whole regional war, on Israel's greater Israel aims. Well, having Turkey completely in the pocket of the West, very much not militaristic, further deep into the NATO EU pocket, that would, that would be a very big comfort for Israel and the U.S., knowing that there's not this more wild card character of Erdogan who may actually, I don't know, potentially support his main enemy, Iran. I think this is very unlikely. I think even Erdogan actually would not support Iran based on a lot of the hostilities that have risen between these two nations very recently. But either way, from a US, EU, NATO perspective, Israel perspective, it would be much better to have these, as you said, Dimitri, Masonic, potentially even crypto-Jewish characters in power, these secularists, because this would also make it much easier for Turkey to enter the European Union. Obviously, Imamoglu is a very secular, even compared to Kılıçdaroğlu, he is much more liberal, much more progressive. So that would make Turkey a much more welcome addition to the globalist, globo-homo EU family. It would help them bolster a potential EU army as NATO becomes less relevant and the US potentially withdraws. And of course, everybody knows where I'm going with this. This will create the conditions for an EU and Turkey versus Russia confrontation. And people have probably heard a lot of the news about the new F-47 that is potentially being developed by Trump. But the other headline, of course, this is from the New York Post: Trump eyes lifting sanctions, resuming sale of prized fighter jets to Turkey. This is from today, the 21st. President Donald Trump is considering lifting sanctions on resuming the sale of fighter jets to Turkey after a conversation with President Erdogan. Trump expressed an intent to help finalize the sale of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey and is open to the idea of selling Turkey its true prized goal, F-35 jets, if the two sides can come to an agreement that renders Turkey's Russian S-400 system inoperable, two sources confirmed to Fox News Digital. That agreement could look like partially disassembling the machinery or moving it to a U.S.-controlled base in Turkey. Congress approved the $23 billion sale of 40 F-16s and modernization kits for 79 in its current fleet to Turkey last year. But there are ongoing negotiations between Turkey's defense ministry and Lockheed Martin, which builds the jet. Trump's team has asked for legal and technical analysis of how it could avoid finding Turkey in violation of countering America's adversaries through sanctions acts. Sanctions, according to one source familiar with the request, the State Department and National Security Council could not be reached for comment. The U.S. agreed to extend a waiver allowing Turkey to buy Russian natural gas until May, Bloomberg reported on Thursday. Trump and Erdogan spoke by phone on Sunday, and the Turkish government is looking to firm up plans to bring Erdogan to the U.S. to visit with Trump in the near future. The Turkish embassy pointed to a readout to the call from Erdogan's office, which said the president had expressed to Trump, in order to develop cooperation between the two countries in the field of defense industry, it is necessary to end sanctions, finalize F-16 procurement process, and finalize Turkey's reparticipation in the F-35 program. Erdogan asked the U.S. to lift sanctions on Turkey, where a new government force, HTS, overthrew Bashar al-Assad with Turkish backing. The U.S. side did not provide a readout of the call. So obviously, not only is Turkey about to get these F-35s, but ironically enough, and let's say Russia and Turkey do go to war, if Turkey has disabled its S-400 air defense systems, then that actually might serve to Russia's advantage in this, in this hypothetical situation, of course. And in many ways, Trump might not necessarily want to see Erdogan overthrown, but other rogue elements within the American apparatus may very much not agree with that. And I could see MI6, others potentially working with this. However, Alexander Dugin had a take on this, where he provides a Russian perspective on the protests, and he says, for sure, this time Russia will not make any attempt to help Erdogan. The opposition to him is partly Kemalist, partly liberal, but after betrayal of Assad, he has no chance to rely neither on us nor on Iran. Trump doesn't like him. His ties with MI6 more are fatal. So he's implying that there's an MI6 connection with Erdogan, which would make sense given the sort of under-the-table support for Israel and their energy. Of course, we discussed the deal that the Azerbaijani state oil magnate, their state oil cartel, has agreed to with Israel to explore for natural gas and oil off the coast of Gaza. So clearly Turkey and the Turkosphere very much are still tied in with Israel. Of course, not only was HTS and SNA behind the fall of Assad, and that was backed by Turkey, but all these fighters from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, these other places in the Turkish world, they were, brought in and then entered Syria through Turkey that, allowed them to enter in and start doing this. But Dugin and some of his other posts, unfortunately, he even posts about how, we can be friends with the Kemalists. This actually might be better than us than Erdogan, because he's, of course, hating on Erdogan, who has openly sided with the Ukrainians, even more than certain European countries, has expressed his desire to see full Ukrainian territorial sovereignty restored, including Crimea. So obviously Erdogan understands that Russia and Turkey are ultimately civilizational enemies. He sees a path forward to more power on the Black Sea. And of course, we know that in the future, one of the big things that will compel the Russians to attack Turkey will be the closing of the Bosphorus Straits. And I could totally see someone like Imamoglu getting pressured to do something like that as, of course, the EU and the West dangle EU memberships and, the lifting of these sanctions that we just talked about, all these new weapons that, of course, we know that Turkey wants to expand farther to its east, but we know they also really want to expand towards Greece. And even if they don't attack mainland Greece, they definitely want to be able to, in a big military show of force, hopefully bloodlessly or with minimal bloodshed, take a lot of the islands that are mere miles off of their shore. And of course, Eldris Galaktia, Metropolitan Neophytos and Morphu have talked about how basically what's going to happen before the Russians come in and assault Turkey is places like Lesbos, Crete, and even Cyprus will come under a sort of brief occupation by Turkey. Some say even 2 or 3 days. And then on Cyprus and these places, the Turks will be forced to rapidly retreat to confront the Russians in the Black Sea and potentially in the Sea of Marmara and also, I believe, in Syria. And this, of course, brings us back into the situation there. This is from Jason Ditz. Syrian government, SDF, begin talks on integrating Kurds into army. While the process is still far from finished, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham-dominated Syrian government and the Kurdish SDF began talks on Wednesday about integrating the SDF forces into the army. During the Syrian civil war, the SDF set up control over substantial territory in the northeast with the backing of the U.S. The territory includes a lot of Syria's oil and gas resources, and the HTS has said it is a priority to establish strong central control over all of Syria and not allow autonomous regions like the Kurds have set up. The Kurdish Authority have agreed with the government in principle on the idea of unification, including the SDF integration, but a lot of the specifics of how that works have yet to be worked out. Last week's announcement of a very Islamist-centric constitution has raised further concerns about the process across Syria, including among Kurdish groups. Be sure to listen to our recent episode of Ether Hour with Jim Jatris. We do talk a lot about Syria, so check that out. But this goes on to say these early talks, which started on Wednesday, seem very preliminary. It focused on a mechanism for joint committees that will be set up in April, talk about the need for ceasefires in place across all of Syria. The ceasefire isn't just about the recent massive surge of violence in the Alawite northeast and the subsequent massacre of civilians. From the Kurdish perspective, the biggest issue is active aggression by Turkey and their allies in the SNA faction against Kurdish territory. SNA and Turkish pushes against the SDF happen nearly daily and have been raging for months, killing hundreds. Integration of the SDF may be an issue with Turkey-Syria relations too. Turkey has been very keen to see that the Kurds have no semblance of autonomy and have to submit to the new HTS government. They've taken a wait-and-see approach to unification, but have warned repeatedly they won't stand for any deal that doesn't exclude terrorists from the process. That's a difficult demand to interpret since the HTS itself, which Turkey likes, was originally al-Qaeda in Iraq. In general, though, the comments from Turkish FM Hakan Fidan point to the SDF's largest component, the YPG, being the real target here. The YPG is ideologically similar to the banned PKK in Turkey, and Turkish officials have long presented the two as effectively the same organization. So this obviously ties in with the same reasons that they arrested Mayor of Istanbul, Imamoglu. And for those that don't know, Erdogan was, of course, the mayor of Istanbul before he became the president. Mayor of Istanbul is sort of like this kind of waiting position to where, potential future successors and presidents of Turkey obviously want. I mean, it's a huge city, 16 million people. So if you can win the election there, you really, have a lot of power within Turkey. But as, of course, the situation in Syria unfolds, the prophecies we remember from people like St. Gabriel Ergabadzi, people from St. Philomenos of Jacob's Well, who said that Georgia will melt like a candle and the Russians will descend into Turkey, into Syria, to fight Turkey there. And, of course, President Putin's recent comments that he is ready to support President al-Shara and support, Syrian integration and all these sorts of things. Again, much like the Dugin tweet about how he sees a future of friendship between Russia and these Kemalists, this is not good. This is not showing that the Russians are, as I would say, wise to what is really going on here. And I just really hope that whether it's Putin's successor or whether it's other people within the military are actually aware of this problem. But I'm not super confident because the only person I know that is in any position of notoriety to potentially lead a substantial force within Russia that actually knows about this stuff is Igor Strelkov-Girkin, who is in prison. Of course, we've talked about how he has referenced the prophecies, how he has posted about the situation in Syria, predicted the fall of Assad that occurred, and how Turkey is creating this huge beast on Russia's southern flank. And of course, with their control of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles is, very likely to create a huge issue for Russia, blocking them from what's going on in the rest of the Mediterranean. Of course, we know that not just Syria, but also in Libya and other places, Turkish and Russian proxies clash. So the Turks have many reasons to try to block the Russians from entering the rest of the Mediterranean Sea, least of which, of course, is a potential for Russia to aid Greece if Turkey fulfills its ultimate goals of retaking a lot of these islands. But again, we know that Medvedev, former president of Russia, he has some relations with Metropolitan Neophytos of Morphu. Maybe he is talking about this kind of thing, but he is no longer super high up in the power sectors, I guess, of the current Russian elite. But unless you have anything to say about the Turkish situation, Dmitry, like I said, the Turkey versus Iran thing is very real, I think, even regardless of if Erdogan falls. But we're going to be watching this very closely. And I don't necessarily think that Erdogan might fall in the next few days, but over the next year, with all of this going on and with potential, I think over the next weeks, we'll see which foreign powers are going to get involved in this, how many people are going to condemn this, if there's going to be international pressure on Erdogan. I think that whether it's Imamoglu defeating Erdogan electorally, I think that's probably the latest down the line that we might see his fall, or some sort of reverse coup happening and people turning these protests into a color revolution that actually does overthrow Erdogan. That would be more on the soon, I guess, end of the spectrum. But the other big wild card, of course, is he could just die. At any point, this old, unhealthy man could just die. And as much as I have a lot of problems with Erdogan, he, of course, turned Hagia Sophia into a mosque. He clearly overthrew the Assad regime and is, unfortunately, being a crypto ally of Israel. I think if I was Turkish, I would support him over these new Kemalist interlocutors who I think want to fully integrate with the West in globo homo and ultimately provoke a war that will, if you listen to certain prophecies, lead to the destruction of a third of the Turkish people, but also, I guess, a third of them converting to Orthodoxy. But one thing as well is you look at Erdogan, and he may not be the most European-looking person, but I think he looks a lot more Greek than Kılıçdaroğlu and Imamoglu, who a lot of them look, specifically Kılıçdaroğlu. I mean, he just looks straight up out of Central Asia. Whereas, many people say that Erdogan is even aware of his substantial, Greek ancestry, but that might just be more, Greek cope because they recognize that Erdogan, for better or for worse, is sort of a strong guy. So they kind of want to identify with him. But I'd love to hear any other speculations you have on the future of this Turkey situation, Dmitry. But then we also have to give our frontline updates regarding Russia-Ukraine.
Of course, and the biggest consideration, and I'm going to paraphrase Igor Strelkov here, because the biggest consideration in the Russo-Turkish war in the near future, most likely with Greece's participation, the closing of the Dardanelles and Bosphorus will, of course, trap any Russian fleet units in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, and of course the Russian base in Khmeimim and Port Tartus, which at the moment are already majorly weakened, and of course the Russian expedition fleet in Libya at the moment, which is helping Field Marshal Haftar. So all of this plays into the closing of those straits. When people consider, well, those straits will be closed, so what? Well, the Russians will be trapped. And Turkey, of course, has major influence, if not direct control, over Al-Jalani, Al-Sharaa. So, of course, a land as well as a sea operation against the Russian expeditionary bases on the coast of those Mediterranean cities, as well as potentially in Libya, it'll greatly exacerbate any sort of future conflict between Russia and Turkey. Of course, we can definitely see that hypothetically in like a war game mode planning style. And naturally, the Southern Caucasus with Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, we don't even have to mention how tumultuous those particular areas are. And of course, the Russian Northern Caucasus is not looking too good either, especially at the moment. There are literally Kafkas oil depots burning right now. One of them has been burning for 3 days because Ukrainian drones have hit it. So let's just say the local gas and oil deposits that Russia has had in the Northern Caucasus are being generally affected by this Russo-Ukrainian war. Russian energy is in a somewhat semi-small crisis at the moment in its western and southern areas, of course, adjacent to Europe, which bring power to all of these great European countries, most of which have right-wing parties in them, which are pro-Russian. So very interesting. And this is how it all ties together to the Russo-Ukrainian war, because at the moment, the eyes of Europe are, of course, on this conflict. The eyes of the world were definitely on it, and everyone was listening and attentively waiting when there were rumors that took place that President Trump and President Putin were speaking on the telephone for 2 hours straight. And what exactly did they agree to? Well, we don't really have a concise sort of statement from either side that sort of summarizes all the points. Well, generally, I'll just note that the American media has been hyper-focusing on the alleged statement, and I say alleged very strongly here, that Putin, and as you mentioned earlier, Conrad, apparently stated that Iran, and he guarantees that Iran will not destroy Israel. Well, I mean, it's a very vague sort of statement, but the Middle East portion of the discussion between Trump and Putin has been very strong. Essentially, they're just both calling for a peace in the Middle East, which I'll be completely honest, the entire world was calling for that since the Second World War. So it's a very generalized statement, doesn't really give us any hints as to what exactly will happen in terms of foreign policy between America and Russia. How will they collaborate? How will they work together in countries like Syria, Turkey, and some of these places, maybe even Israel and Palestine, for example. The other things that the two leaders agreed to was, of course, a 30-day halt on attacks targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Naturally, Putin did not consent to a full ceasefire, and Donald Trump kind of accepted that. And less than a day later, of course, energy infrastructure was in fact struck by the Russians. Now, there were Giran drones, for example, these Shahid drones striking Ukrainian infrastructure. Ukraine retaliates in the most vicious way. And this just happened a few days ago, just before we were recording this episode in Sudzha. So, as you know, last week, Sudzha was again taken back by Russia. And this week, naturally, we were seeing Russian troops progress very quickly across the entire Kursk Oblast, occupied Ukrainian territory, pushing the Ukrainians all the way to the Sumskoye Oblast border. Ukraine still controls roughly, I would say, maybe 10% of what they had at the beginning of the year in the Kurskoye Oblast. But what's very interesting is that the Ukrainians just yesterday, they did actually fire off long-range missiles hitting the Sudzha gas metering station. This is the main, as we said, Sudzha is key because of its gas transportation. We were talking about this prior to, I think, most other reporters in the English language. People were focusing on Sudzha as somehow a stepping stone towards the Kursk nuclear power plant. But we were mentioning the fact that Sudzha is very important in terms of Gazprom and the transportation of gas from Russia to some of these Central and Eastern European countries further towards the west of Ukraine, Hungary, for example, Austria, which have very strong right-wing parties in them. Of course, they depend and they sort of run on the low energy cost issues on their ballot box, right? So they say that they will obtain friendly relations with Russia, and this will result in cheap energy prices. Now, Ukraine has, of course, put all of this into question yesterday by bombing the Sudzha gas metering station, completely destroying it. As they, of course, left Sudzha, so Ukraine has no more forces in Sudzha, the Russians have completely sort of flooded them out, and Ukraine destroyed the gas metering station. And then just literally hours after that, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense releases an open statement, Conrad, where they stated that the Russians themselves blew up their own metering station that they built via Gazprom. So again, taking sort of all of this blame away, I think it's mainly a message to countries like Hungary, Poland, Austria, Slovakia, stating that, look, we Ukrainians it's not our fault that gas will not be coming to Europe for this particular pipeline in the near future because the Russians were willing to repair it. It was the Russians. They blew up, just like the Russians apparently blew up their own Nord Stream pipeline. That's just what Russians do. They build pipelines and then they blow them up. Makes complete sense, of course. But this is the Ukrainian claim. The Russians are pushing them back. The Russians are also occupying certain portions of the Sumskoye Oblast as they're pushing the Ukrainians further back. The Ukrainians, in fact, are losing so much ground and armored vehicles trying to reinforce these villages that they're still holding that. And it's in very piecemeal, sort of disorganized fashion. You see these tanks essentially rolling with huge gaps between them, not much support. And Ukrainians are losing these tanks just literally on these open roads, Russian drones smashing into the missiles, a lot of destroyed Ukrainian armor as they're sort of heading at full speed towards these supportive positions, trying to hold the Russians back. So Russians are making incredible progress. And I have to say that it's completely correct that Putin did not agree to the complete ceasefire. That would be, I think, almost a sabotage of his own geopolitical principles, frankly, because Russia's making incredible progress on that northern Sudzha-Kursk front line. Now, the Ukrainians are not just sitting back and sort of watching this take place. We did, of course, predict this weeks ago, Conrad. We said that the Ukrainians are preparing, and this is, of course, reports from people like Arestovich, who, frankly, it seems like he snitched on his own forces. He was saying that Ukrainians were preparing a several thousand-strong attack force, potentially to storm either Bryanskoye Oblast in the north, which is adjacent to Belarus, and, of course, just south of the Kurskoye Oblast, unfortunately, the long-suffering Belgorod Oblast. And the Ukrainians, it seems, have elected the Belgorod Oblast as their new area of attack, and they've invaded 3 village areas in the north of the Belgorod Oblast. They attacked the village of Demidovka. They've attacked in central Belgorod Oblast the Kachakov Yar, and just south of that, the village of Vyazovoye. Now, mind you, Ukrainians are only several kilometers deep into the Belgorodskoye Oblast. It's not like a blitzkrieg attack like they've done in Kursk over 225 days ago, right? In 2024. This is a much more controlled. The Russians were a lot more prepared, but Ukrainian boots are currently on the ground in the Belgorod Oblast. There's hot fighting going on, and at the same time, the other front lines are really not moving. So all the eyes are naturally in this northern portion, and the 30-day ceasefire really lasted literally a day, and it didn't even apply to energy at the moment. Of course, the Ukrainians continue to bomb Russian energy to the point where this is probably the most incredible news, but Ukrainian drones were shot down over the Volgogradskoye Oblast, trying to strike at energy facilities there. Now, if you look at a map where Volgograd Oblast is located, it's literally where, Volgograd is Stalingrad, is Tsaritsino, a city on the Volga. So far, like literally almost in Siberia, right? It's incredibly far from the front lines. So Ukrainian drones, 34 of them were shot down all the way over there. So Ukrainians are flying their military drones hundreds of kilometers deep into Russian territory, aiming for strategic energy. Sometimes I want to say civilian, but most likely military targets of the Russians. Essentially, none of European Russia is safe from Ukrainian drones at the moment, which is incredibly scary. These drones are, can you imagine the PTSD and the trauma being committed upon the Russians? And likewise, of course, by the Russians on Ukrainian citizens who are being caught in the crossfires of this incredible conflict right now. It's probably immense. And of course, the particular psychological and spiritual help that will be needed for both of these brotherly people will be, of course, enormous in the near future. So the fighting is definitely ongoing. And some absolutely, I would say, Call of Duty-esque, or I don't know what to even compare it to, but some incredibly savage fighting taking place near Pokrovsk, which currently is not surrounded. The Russians are still trying to push through that northwestern side of Pokrovsk. The village of Shevchenko is being hit. Essentially, it's changing hands almost every week. On 1 week, you check Shevchenko belongs to the Ukrainians, then the Russians take it, then the Ukrainians take it, then the Russians take it. The entire village looks like a small version of Bakhmut, perhaps. The losses are being counted in tens per day in this particular village alone. The Ukrainians are apparently sending in their fresh drafted recruits with almost like less than a few months training. The Russians are allegedly sending in prisoners as well. It's not looking like the most humane fighting taking place in the Pokrovskoye Oblast. The Russians are really trying to surround the city and take it in a very World War II type fashion with sort of minimal casualties, because Bakhmut, Avdiivka, the Mariupol approach very much causes a lot of, shall we say, political distress and naturally destroys the various landscapes in which the siege is ongoing. So it's quite curious. And at the same time, Khersonskoye Oblast, it's important because the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant is just up north of the Dnieper River. So the Khersonskoye Oblast for the Ukrainians is very key because it controls that southern Dnieper region, and the Ukrainians continue to bomb long-range Russian villages, continuing to injure people. There's roughly 1 to 2 Russians that die per week from these long-range drone and missile strike bombardments over the Dnieper. So there's no real peace anywhere across the Ukrainian battlefronts. But at the moment, the biggest movements are in that Kurskaya, Sumskaya, and the Russian Belgorodskoye Oblast. So quite intense fighting. And at the same time, it's very interesting how the US media, Conrad, is focusing very much on the Middle Eastern portion of the Trump-Putin discourse, while the Russians are ignoring anything Putin may have said hypothetically about Iran, Israel. They're just hyper-focusing on the fact that there was a potential ceasefire that could have taken place, but unfortunately did not resolve. And so at the moment, all sides are fighting. And the Russians, I would just say that, especially the Russians I've been talking to or listening, following on the front lines, they're not really looking for a ceasefire at the moment. The great successes that they're seeing in Kursk, the uplifting, of course, the coming 9th of May parade, because it is the 80th year anniversary of Russia's victory in the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. So the Russians are they really want success prior to this massive parade that they're going to stage on the Red Square, hopefully with proper anti-drone technology and defense units set up so that these various international partners and all kinds of diplomatic friends can arrive and experience the safety of Russia's cities, unlike what Ukraine has been doing to Russia recently. So it'll be very interesting. But Russian energy is in a state of crisis in Eastern Europe. It'll be very interesting to how Putin kind of explains this to his European allies and exactly how Ukraine is going to play off the fact that everyone, I think, is under no illusion that Ukraine destroyed the gas metering station in Sudzha and has essentially thrown its own supporters, its own EU, NATO countries, which it wants to join in these particular unions, how it's going to explain the fact that it's damaged their energy prospects for the near future. So a lot of interesting developments. And frankly, I think me and you, Conrad, both have already come to the conclusion that a Minsk-free, any sort of 30-day ceasefire, it's not for the sake of peace. It's not for the sake of, a peaceful resolution to the conflict. It would only extend the bloodshed. And what Russia needs at the moment is a swift victory, a swift development of perhaps even a new mobilization, as Strelkov and other patriots have been calling for. Russia needs decisive action and needs to maybe even utilize Alexander Lukashenko to strike at Ukraine from the north. That is the only way to end the situation, which at the moment has been progressing longer than the Russian involvement in the First World War, this Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which I'm not sure if future textbooks and history books will refer to it as a civil war or as a civilizational beginning of the Third World War, the sort of like the Third Reich blitzkrieg against France, perhaps like the first of the great battles, or maybe even the conquest of Poland by Adolf Aloisevich Hitler. So it'll be very interesting as to how our descendants will exactly picture this conflict, which we're attempting to cover in such intense detail.
Now, as far as the Civil War question you posed ago, I think it's going to depend on, well, it won't ever be framed in the West like that, but it'll depend on how much territory Russia can get. And of course, the unfortunate news about the Belgorod Oblast aside, Russia has made more incursions into Sumy, more incursions into Kharkov. And of course, Donetsk is closer and closer to being totally liberated every day. So that, of course, is the eternal question. And I think, as Jim Jatras said in our recent Ether Hour, if Russia does fall for some of these symbolic gestures and trusts the West again, and whether it's a Minsk III or some other sort of complex agreement that potentially could involve Russia scaling down its support for Iran and China for sort of promises in Ukraine, as Jim said, I think all of that would be very foolish because ultimately at this point, Russia is able to achieve many goals, including annexing large portions of Ukraine, clearly on the battlefield alone. So they should be focusing on that and then forcing whatever negotiations eventually come to happen very much on their terms. However, again, the Jewish faction within Russia could throw a curveball at us, and I hope that Putin is simply, doing brinksmanship and presenting as this sort of agreeable character for, propaganda purposes, because obviously the purpose of all of this ceasefire talk from the US and everybody is to present the Russians as the side that don't want peace, to make sure that, if aggression is to get escalated, that it's clear that Russia didn't want peace and that America and Ukraine are legitimate and valid and correct in, escalating tensions again and potentially pushing, the front line back or any number of other, sanctions escalations and whatnot. So all of that is in play right now, but this is from Reuters. Russia says Ukrainian drone attack on oil depot already violates proposed ceasefire. Russia's foreign ministry said on Thursday that Ukraine had already violated a proposed ceasefire on energy sites in the 3-year-old war by attacking a Russian oil depot. Russia's TASS news agency reported foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova told state television Channel 1 that it was up to the United States, which had proposed the ceasefire, to confront Ukraine over its actions. The Kremlin said this week that Russian President Vladimir Putin had agreed in a call with his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump to observe a 30-day ceasefire on energy targets. The accord fell short of a wider agreement that the U.S. had sought, and which was accepted by Ukraine for a blanket 30-day truce. Firefighters in southern Russia were still battling a blaze at an oil depot triggered by a Ukrainian drone attack, regional authorities said on the Telegram messaging app. We believe that the Kiev regime has already broken the ceasefire proposed by the U.S. president, Zakharova said on television. Now, the question is, you will forgive me, how is Washington going to handle this terrorist scum gone mad? How are they going to put them in their place and get them on to something like the right track? Ukrainian officials have also accused Russia of failing to align their actions with their pledges by launching attacks on civilian targets. So it appears that this 30-day ceasefire is already dead, and this is just another chip in, Trump's negotiating tactics, where, of course, we know he said he would have a ceasefire and end this war before he even took office. Obviously, that is not true. And as I said before, I think if the Russians are smart and aren't, taking advice from bad actors or, nefarious shadowy figures, they would assert the situation militarily on the ground and only negotiate from a position of very broad strength. But unless you have anything else to update us from the battlefield, Dmitry, any other Russian political updates, I think the logical place to go from here is everything going on in Germany and Romania. Of course, we've seen another Romanian candidate, the supposedly far-right Diana Sosoaca, also barred from the Romanian presidency, much like Georgescu. Of course, George Simion, the only right-wing candidate who's been allowed to advance. He's going to, I guess, be running as that candidate, but he was much more already established. He was already the leader of the second largest party in Romania. So Romanian democracy seems to be dead, but, Romania is one of those countries, much like Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, that, Russia might try to consult and, initially use some soft power to get them more aligned with them and then allow them to take some land or secure political sovereignty for some of their minorities that are, specifically the Romanian and Hungarian minorities, are very much suffering in Western Ukraine. So some of these EU countries are very much going to come into play.
No, absolutely. Like we saw recently, Macron again playing this UN EU peacekeeper, right? He's essentially stating that UN peacekeepers should be sent on a mission to Ukraine. This is Macron's proposal. Apparently, he discussed this with the UN Secretary General, but it would need Security Council approval. Frankly, I think Russia and China will definitely be vetoing this. Lithuania has put up its hand and said that they are willing to send Lithuanian peacekeepers to Ukraine to sustain this future Minsk-free type agreement. So all these very lovely countries. Of course, Orban commented on the whole EU summit that Macron was at, essentially stated that, look, I could see in everyone's eyes that Ukraine has lost this war. Getting involved was a mistake. The Hungarians were right. So Orban is essentially stating, look, you guys should have just listened to me. I was the prime minister of a major EU country. Look, we were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the past. We have huge political capital in terms of experience. You should have just listened to the Hungarians. And, maybe I agree, Conrad, because frankly, a lot of Europeans seem to be making exactly the wrong decisions. And the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, actually said a very similar thing. He said, I quote, "This has gone too far. Countless meetings in Europe about Ukraine are not bringing peace." Well, I think it's quite obvious at this point, or if, more than 3 years into the conflict, that, all these endless talks have, of course, not actually provided anything. And naturally, the great EU discourse around peace in Ukraine is, of course, meeting an end at the fact that Zelensky is not willing really to sit at the table and really provide the necessary concessions. And what's being formulated right now, and this is very interesting because it kind of, our discussion with Patrick Lancaster about some of these former issues like the MH17 crash in 2014, the fact that the so-called Bucha massacre took place outside of Kiev, caused by the Russians. Even Macron is coming up and creating this mythology that, look, I actually tried to create a peace between Russia and Ukraine all the way in February 2022. Macron says that on February 28th, he called Putin to meet in Gamil, Belarus, to actually, and Gamil, by the way, a former majority Ashkenazi city, so very symbolic for a sort of Minsk-free type place. But Macron said that he urged Putin to meet in Gamil to discuss a Russo-Ukrainian conflict. This is 6 days into the war. And Zelensky commented on this, stating that he was willing actually to meet the Russians in Belarus for a peace 1 week into the SMO, except it was the nationalistic Ukrainian battalions which prevented him from doing so. So it wasn't the particular tribe that runs Ukraine that, essentially led the entire country into this conflict that's to blame. It's the white Banderite sort of hyper-nationalistic Ukrainians who continued to fight the Russians on the front lines of the SMO that caused the entire peace conference to spiral out of control. So again, you notice the blame shifting here. I think we're going to see a lot more of this in the coming sort of months, especially once Trump realizes that his whole plan for a swift peace treaty in Ukraine is going to fail. It's either the blame is going to fall on these hyper-corrupt Ukrainian elites, which are frankly not ethnic Ukrainians, not ethnically Slavic at all, or it's going to fall on these hyper-nationalistic factions. And frankly, a lot of them are very delusional. They do have Banderite roots, but ostensibly speaking, they are nationalistic. In a European context, if they were French nationalists, we would most likely look at them in some sort of admiration because they'd want to, for example, secure France's sovereignty and rid it of cultural enrichment. But these nationalists, of course, their attitudes being cemented in a Ukrainian context, of course, lead to destructive Russophobic attitudes, and frankly, the fact that their leaders are all Philo-Semites or frankly, literally members of the tribe only make this even more complex. So it'll be interesting how these diplomatic discussions go forward. And frankly, we do know, I think Donald Trump's discussion with Putin, there are some conspiracies that Trump actually did propose something to Putin regarding the Middle East. This trade that we spoke about, Iran for Ukraine, for example. And there was a discourse that Trump would want to leave Ukraine, and this is Russian politologist, for example, Maxim Shevchenko, who's quite left-wing, but I would say is more like center-left. He has a huge YouTube channel. He did propose the statement that, look, Trump wants to distance himself from Ukraine. It's a failed Bidenite project. He wants to move away from that. He wants to focus on Israel. He wants to focus on Zionism. And in fact, he's willing to give massive concessions. But if he doesn't believe that the EU and these NATO member states of Europe will actually want to, of course, give Putin some of these massive concessions in Ukraine. So it's almost like the European Union, Conrad, is restructuring itself militarily, economically, and even energy-wise. Notice because Macron at the moment is the monopoly holder on energy in all of Europe. Germany at the moment is starved. All of these center-east European countries, Poland, Slovakia, Austria, Hungary, even Romania, they're very much dependent on a lot of this energy export from the east. And Macron is the only one who seemingly has energy independence through the 57 nuclear reactors which France has. A lot of them, of course, are powered by uranium purchases from Africa. And we know that Russia's particular involvement in those Sahel uprisings, of course, contributed to France's energy independence deterioration. But I think, generally speaking, Macron, he has a lot of the chips on the table in terms of independence as a decision maker in Europe. So a lot will be up to him as far as, will Europe continue to support the failed Ukrainian project? Will it continue to prop up Zelensky? And part of me feels, Conrad, that I think these European countries, especially their Russophobic elites, and a lot of them are not natively European anyway, will, of course, continue to push the Ukrainian project because it will lead to, frankly, Slavic death, first and foremost. It will lead to the weakening of the Orthodox Christian Church, which is a huge, I would say, beacon of conservatism in the European world, especially now that Protestantism and Roman Catholicism has gone downhill in terms of their views on just traditional morality and Christian culture. And going forward, I think really that weakening of Eastern Europe from the perspective of these Talmudic globalist elites is one of the main goals, which is probably why they want the war in Russia and Ukraine to continue forward, and probably why Macron, I think, will begin to champion this position that, look, Trump, leave it all to me. I will handle this European scenario and push it forward towards its potential end until the last Ukrainian.
Very unfortunate, of course. Ukraine is probably going to start have personnel issues. They're going to increase their mobilization, eventually getting down to forcing all 18-year-olds and up to hit the front lines. And in general, this is just a very big tragedy for Orthodox Christianity in general. But you spoke of France, the other big player, of course, in the EU being Germany. And there's some big news regarding the new government coalition. This is from BNN. CDU leader Merz threatens resignation if SPD talks fail. In a significant political development, Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, has announced that he will resign if coalition negotiations with the Social Democratic Party fail. This declaration has sent ripples through the German political landscape, raising questions about the future of the CDU and the broader implications for the country's governance. During a recent public address, Merz stated, "If we do not succeed, my career is over at a time when I can handle it." The statement reveals both the gravity of the current political situation and Merz's personal stakes in the outcome of the coalition negotiations. His candid admission underscores the pressure he faces as the leader of a party that has been struggling to regain its footing in the wake of recent electoral setbacks. The coalition negotiations between the CDU and SPD are critical for shaping Germany's political future. Following the last federal elections, there has been a push for stable government capable of addressing pressing issues such as the economy, healthcare, and climate change. All right, this is a nonsense article. What about immigration? The CDU under Merz's leadership aims to forge a partnership with the SPD to create a robust governing coalition. However, the complexities of political alignments and differing party agendas have made these negotiations challenging. So obviously the CDU, they're already conceding so much nonsense to the SPD, giving them pretty much everything they want so they can enter into this coalition. And apparently the SPD is still being difficult, which I don't think this will actually collapse. I think they will probably come to an agreement because at the end of the day, nothing unites, retarded Germans more than this idea that we need to be a bulwark against potential Hitler too, potential Nazism, potentially our people, standing up for themselves for the first time in almost 100 years. But yeah, I mean, I guess if Merz resigned and this happened, it would be a pretty good look for the AfD, which again, if all this coalition in general just flounders and looks weak, it's good for the AfD. And, potentially there could even be another snap election called sooner rather than later if, this coalition of the willing against, I don't know, Nazism or whatever they call it, just never actually manifests. But another big piece of news, of course, this is from Balkan Insight. Bosnia steps up efforts to arrest Dodik with nationwide warrants. So for those that don't know, the High Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina has been attempting to arrest and remove the leader of Republika Srpska, Milorad Dodik, who he's been meeting with Vučić recently. Obviously, we've discussed the huge Serbian protests. Be sure to listen to the Ether Hour with Jim Jatras if you want to hear a longer take on the Balkans and Serbia as well. He's very, very much in the know about this sort of thing. He knows Dodik personally. He's been to these areas, so be sure to check that out. But this is the article. As the political crisis in Bosnia escalates, the state court issued a nationwide arrest warrant for the president of Bosnia's Serb-dominated Republika Srpska entity, Milorad Dodik, and two others on Monday. The court of Bosnia and Herzegovina confirmed that it had issued a decision accepting the proposal of the prosecutor's office, which ordered the detention of Dodik, Ninan Stevandik, and Radovan Viskovic. You will be informed of all other details once the conditions allow for it, it said. Dodik, Republika Srpska Prime Minister Viskovic, and entity assemblyman Stevandic are all suspected of an attack on the constitutional order of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Prior to the nationwide warrant, Bosnia's prosecutor's office issued an arrest warrant for all three of them on March 12th, after they failed to appear at two summonses for questioning before the state prosecution. 2 days later, the state court ordered a month's detention for Dodik, Viskovic, and Stevandic. According to Bosnian legislation, the detention decision was necessary in order to issue a nationwide warrant. Despite the warrants, Stevandic left Bosnia for Serbia on Saturday, after which Bosnian media reported that his security escort returned the following day without him. In a statement given for Serbia's TV Happy, Stevandic said that the leadership of Republika Srpska was and will stay unified. We have truly acted as one, meeting the legislative and executive authorities as well, the President of the Republic. We held daily consultations. We did not allow ourselves to be divided, nor did we let any ambassadors insert an obstacle that would disrupt this unity, Stevandic said, adding that this is why they were all on a domestic wanted list in Bosnia. Dodik has not commented yet on the new warrant, but has posted on X that Republika Srpska is taking steps to form its own border police, which will control the border between the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Republika Srpska, the two entities in the country. A working group has also been formed, which held its first meeting today on the drafting of laws that will regulate the work of the border police on the territory of Republika Srpska, Dodik wrote. So, the emergence of Republika Srpska as a potentially independent state is getting closer and closer. I have been to these border crossings, the signs on the mountainous highways where Bosnia and Herzegovina meet Republika Srpska. It's a very beautiful place, and it'll be tragic to see, just in less than 30 years, more potential bloodshed return to these areas as we are still reeling from the Bosnian and Kosovo wars, of course, when we see all of these news in these regions and, potential for escalations again. But this is how things go in the Balkans ever since, Orthodoxy was abandoned as the unifying factor, and the Roman Catholic papists, came in with their Venetian merchants. And then, of course, the Turks came in and converted Bosnia, created Bosnians basically by forcibly converting people, to Islam, and then Albanians becoming Muslim as well. This has led to, this sort of endless cycle of violence in this region. And hopefully in the future, Orthodoxy can be restored worldwide. But the other big news, of course, comes, again, I don't know how Srpska independence or potentially Srpska joining Serbia, that would probably help them in light of this news, which is a new military alliance is formed between Kosovo, Albania, and Croatia. And this is upsetting the Serbs. This is from MSN. A newly signed trilateral military alliance declaration between Kosovo, Albania, and Croatia has ignited a wave of controversy across the Western Balkans, raising concerns about its potential impact on regional stability, diplomatic relations, and the broader geopolitical balance of Southeast Europe. While the three countries have framed the pact as a step toward enhanced security cooperation and regional peace, critics argue that the move could deepen political divisions, escalate tensions with neighboring states, particularly Serbia, and complicate existing diplomatic efforts aimed at long-term reconciliation in the Balkans. The declaration outlines military collaboration and joint training, cybersecurity and coordination, rapid response mechanisms, and defense procurement. But beyond its technical aspects, many analysts interpret this alliance as a strong political statement, especially with Kosovo at the center of the pact. Kosovo, which declared independence from Serbia in 2008 and is still not recognized by Belgrade or several UN member states, signing a formal military agreement with two NATO members, have been viewed by some as a provocative geopolitical maneuver. This alliance is not just about defense, it's about redefining the regional balance of power, said Dr. Marko Ivkovic, a security analyst based in Belgrade. It sends a message that Kosovo is increasingly being treated as a de facto NATO partner, even if it is not formally recognized. Unsurprisingly, Serbian officials have reacted with strong condemnation. Belgrade has accused the alliance of threatening peace in the region and undermining ongoing EU-facilitated dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo. Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić called the move a dangerous escalation and warned that it could provoke a regional arms race. This agreement does not contribute to peace. It isolates Serbia and fuels division, he stated in a televised address. We will not stand idly by while others try to change the security architecture of the region unilaterally. Well, it's good you say that, Vučić, but you're also experiencing some of the largest protests in your country's history. So I don't know if you're in any position to, even frankly, be helping Dodik with his Bosnia situation, let alone confront a Croatia-Kosovo-Albania alliance, and it appears that they're also trying to goad Bulgaria into signing on to this alliance, which would pretty much completely surround Serbia. Obviously, their enemies are still in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The only border they'd have with a friendly country would be Romania and Hungary, and I don't even know how friendly the Romanians are to the Serbs these days, but this is a very unfortunate development in the Balkans, and it appears that ironically, this could come to play in a future conflict with Turkey and Russia, because obviously this alliance between, Albania, Kosovo, and Croatia would very likely side with the Turks. Meanwhile, Republika Srpska and Serbia, and hopefully Montenegro the Serbian population there would ultimately side with the Russians. And I think Bulgaria, it's accurate to say they are one of the ultimate wild cards in that region. So unless you have any thoughts about what's going on in the Balkans, Dimitri, we do also need to talk about some church news.
No, absolutely. I think, look, we'll start off with the somewhat ambiguous church news prior to going on to some of the maybe more somber stories. This is very interesting. On the 20th of March, 2025, the Russian Moscow Patriarchate Synod met and they made some pretty interesting decisions. 3 bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church were removed from their position, in particular, Bishop Adrian of Rzhev. And Rzhev, if you recall, is just west of Moscow. It's located between Moscow and Smolensk. The infamous Rzhev meat grinder, the huge battles which took place in 1942, 1943, of course, were literally located near this particular city. This is where between 1 million and 2 million Russians died fighting the Third Reich in this crazy sort of a no man's land area. So quite a sort of somber particular landscape. But Bishop Adrian, of course, was only 74 years of age. The standard retirement age for Russian bishops is 75. So he was removed without gratitude, simply moved off of his diocese. There seems to be no bishop at the moment. The diocese is vacant. And the other bishop they removed was Bishop Jacob of Naryan Mar. Now, Bishop Jacob was only 64, so again, 11 years from retirement. Naryan Mar is located just in North Russia on the Arctic Circle, so very far, basically very low populated diocese. A lot of native peoples there, as well as, of course, ethnic Russians who were members of that diocese. He was removed again without any sort of comment whatsoever. And if Bishop Basil, this is the most interesting one, he was only 46 years of age, so quite a young bishop. He had close to 3 decades more of service that he could have given, but he was removed. He was the Bishop of Kasimov, which is to the east of Moscow, between Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod. And all 3 of these bishops were essentially removed without any sort of comment, without any gratitude or thank you. They were just sent to respective monasteries, completely fired from their seats. The synod, of course, apparently could just clarify that Bishop Adrian of Rzhev may have had some conflict because he tried to turn a local monastery into a parish, like make a sort of conversion move, which doesn't happen very often. Monasteries not very easily dissolved, so to speak, like in church history. It's very kind of a complicated issue. He tried to do that, and apparently he was removed. So, and I would say, just to comment on this, Conrad, I think the Russian church at the moment is in a very sensitive position, especially I wouldn't want to, I would provide maybe advice to bishops not to maybe overstep at the moment, because the Russian church is in a state of great flux and turmoil, a lot of pressure, both internally from the Russian state as well as externally from the persecution taking place in Ukraine, as well as Estonia and other Baltic countries, and even places like China, Japan, where the Russian dioceses are technically under the control of the Moscow Patriarchate. So with all this pressure taking place, some of these bishops making the wrong decisions, of course, will lead to their swift dismissal through sort of synodal decree from the top. As uncomfortable and maybe optically unsound as that is, it's just the reality at the moment that the church is just simply in a state of extreme strife and pressure. So I think that's a pretty major consideration, especially I think minor clergy most definitely, but even bishops, it seems, are not far away from being scolded for incorrect behavior or maybe wrong decisions. And what took place as well was Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy has been released from house arrest, so he can now, of course, travel sort of all around Ukraine if he wishes. And Metropolitan Theodosius, of course, is one of our most sort of spoken about bishops. He's been experiencing persecution. Officially, I think he's already a confessor of the faith because he's literally been beaten, assaulted. His parish has taken, has stood up against the persecutors of Orthodoxy in Ukraine. He's, by literally textbook standards, he's already a confessor of the faith. So I think he's almost eligible for sainthood during his own life. But that's, of course, if he carries out the rest of his dutiful tenureship as bishop in a very Orthodox fashion, because we do know there are figures in Orthodox history, even like Origen, for example, who were Orthodox for a time, and then through the heretical behaviors and things that they wrote, they, of course, fell away from the church. So, of course, it's a marathon, not a sprint. But Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy also held a very notable funeral on the 21st of March for a very pious Orthodox Christian lady. This was Valentina Buzina. She was 85 years of age. She passed away in his diocese, and she visited his various churches and cathedrals quite often. And she's actually the mother of a very famous Ukrainian journalist who was murdered on the 16th of April, 2015. Seems like a long time ago now, literally almost a decade ago. And Ales Buzina was a famous Orthodox Christian and I would say Russo-Ukrainian journalist. He was a monarchist. He was a nationalist. He wanted Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus to unite into one superstate. During the Maidan, he, of course, opposed Poroshenko, opposed Kolomoisky, opposed all of these degenerate technocrats. He was a great journalist. There are some amazing interviews of Ales Buzina on YouTube where he's speaking in Russian or Ukrainian, advocating for Russo-Ukrainian unity on a common Orthodox Christian basis. And he wanted, of course, the two countries to, and even the three countries, to be united under a common Orthodox Christian monarch, which is, of course, amazing for someone from Ukraine to have these sort of views. But his pious mother, of course, passed away 10 years after her son's murder, and she was given a really beautiful eulogy by Metropolitan Theodosius. He, of course, remembered her as a very pious woman, and he spoke fondly. He said that, look, through all the suffering and the hardship she went through the last 10 years, she'll be reunited with her son in heaven. That's very beautiful, sort of just a small tidbit, like a very minor story about a pious person from Ukraine at the moment. There are still many of these very pious and prayerful people in this long-suffering land. And we see another very interesting story from Kurakhova, where currently, of course, in North Donetsk Oblast, where Donetsk Oblast meets Lugansk Oblast, a lot of battles taking place there. A Father John Krapenko, a military priest of the Russian Orthodox Church, actually, he was targeted by Ukrainian long-range missiles. Actually, the explosion tore off his leg, so his entire leg was amputated. He's the first Orthodox priest, I believe, on the front lines who's received a full amputation, probably since the Second World War, I believe. And he released a very cheerful POV-type video from the hospital, where with a smile on his face, he said that Russians and Ukrainians should unite around their common Orthodox Christian values, and he holds no anger towards, again, the Ukrainians, who he was, sort of not fighting against, but he was reinforcing his own Russian troops. And Father John kind of gives us this almost light that despite the fact that, he may not even be able to provide pastoral guidance anymore, or even commit to the sacraments with his huge disability, he's still looking forward to the inevitable unity between the Russian peoples and Ukrainian Malorosian people. So it's quite beautiful that this optimism still exists even in the most bleakest of places, where literally apocalyptic battles are taking place and explosions are killing tens of people. So quite amazing. And the other big story from the beginning of the week, Conrad, we spoke about this off air, but the former spiritual father, the confessor of Patriarch Kirill himself, the elder Ilya Elijah Nozdrin, has passed away in the Optina Pustin Monastery, the famous Optina Monastery located in Russia. As we all know, the Optina elders, many saints coming from this monastery in the 19th and early 20th century. And Elder Elijah Ilya was almost one of these particular elders in the 21st century. He was 93 years of age. I think he was a teenager, like 13, perhaps 12. He participated in the Kurskaya Oblast battle, the Battle of Kursk, during the USSR Third Reich battle, the Second World War. And of course, he suffered persecution under the USSR. He became a schema monk. And of course, later he even became the spiritual father and confessor of Patriarch Kirill in the 1990s and the early 2000s. He had very great opinions, naturally, staunch monarchist. He venerated Tsar Nicholas II. He said very strong things against communism, against Lenin in particular, against Stalin. He called Stalin a criminal. He called Lenin an antichrist, as they should be called appropriately. He's been making very strong statements. But around the time, I believe it was around COVID time, if I'm not mistaken, Conrad, he was moved from Moscow. He was located almost in the Kremlin itself. This elder was moved silently, almost deported back to his monastery at Optina. And since then, he hasn't really given many interviews. Before you can see literally him and Vladimir Putin together, he's been kind of shifted away from the limelight. And I believe the reason for this was because he was probably criticizing the COVID lockdowns, probably criticizing some of the COVID-related regimes. And most likely he had some strong words to say about the special military operation at the beginning of 2022. Again, this is just my personal speculation, but Elder Ilya definitely over the last 5 years has been moved away from the sort of centers of patriarchate power. And most definitely he wasn't serving as Patriarch Kirill's spiritual father, at least for the last half a decade, but still one of the most not learned, but I would say spiritual and pious elders the Russian church has had. He's passed away. He's with the Lord now. A huge funeral, of course, took place at the Optina Pustin Monastery. So it's really good to remember him for just the staunch Christian, very orthodox, very zealous beliefs that he held. And frankly, he didn't bend on any particular issue. He wasn't a liberal. He wasn't an ecumenist. And he, of course, said that the Russian people needed to repent in order for their country to be restored. That was the main message which he gave across all of his interviews. He said the Russian people, once they repent, God will give them a second chance. And I think this is basically what we speak about on this podcast on almost a weekly basis, that this is the overarching message for Russia to be restored, for geopolitical balance to be reestablished in the world, for Russia to return to its cataconic role. Of course, repentance is required, a return to Orthodox Christian standards. So these are the few stories we sort of have from the Ukrainian Russian world in Eastern Europe. But most importantly, let's just remember that in June of this year, of course, after Easter, somewhere at the beginning of summer, I believe it's late June, there's going to be some big changes in the Ukrainian church. For example, the official persecution of the Ukrainian church will commence. That is, if you recall, there was like a stand down period. The Ukrainian Verkhovная Rada parliament stated that the Ukrainian church had several months to completely disconnect itself from Moscow, or else all of its parishes and dioceses would begin closing by official state-sanctioned action. So, and we know many thousands of parishes and thousands of cathedrals and monasteries have not been cutting ties with the Moscow Patriarchate as of yet. So they haven't been following the Ukrainian state's rules. And so June of 2025 is the time, I think, if this conflict doesn't end by then, persecution will again reignite, similar to what we saw at the beginning of 2023. We're going to see more monastery seizures, potentially, God forbid, the Pachayev Lavra in the west next to Lvov, a very pro-Ukrainian Banderite region, but this is the second most important monastery in all of Ukraine. A very ancient Lavra, lots of miracle workers came from there, lots of relics, miracle working icons located there. These will be some of the locations I think these anti-Christian Talmudic Banderites will be looking for in terms of closing, shutting down, and of course taking over. So we need to pray for the Christians of Ukraine and pray that there is finally a victory, that the Christians are victorious in this war against their enemies, because otherwise there will be a lot of complexities and the tough times will continue. And most likely we'll be looking for that June 2025 period as a sort of turning point in the Ukrainian church's situation.
Well, I hope that, God protects the persecuted Christians. And of course, I pray that Elder Ilya, his memory is eternal. And I think we can hope that future patriarchs of Russia, future presidents of Russia will continue consulting these sorts of people as their spiritual fathers, because that may be the most important question of leadership in the future, is who are these people's spiritual fathers? Who is this patriarch's spiritual father? Who is this president's spiritual father? And that's going to be a critical component of the growth of orthodoxy worldwide, which we know prophetically will occur. But unfortunately, there's another persecution update, this time from Estonia. This is from Ortho Christian. Constantinople's Estonian Church supports ban of Estonian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. In a new statement from the Public Relations Department, the Patriarchate of Constantinople's Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church, EAOC, came out in support of a ban on the larger Estonian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, calling it a move to strengthen national security. The statement is entitled, "Estonia is on the path towards a unified Orthodox Church." So the EAOC, everyone should just pretty much consider that as the Estonian version of the OCU, schismatic nonsense, Constantinople expanding its territory due to its neo-papist ecclesiology. Of course, the metropolitan of the EAOC is this goober-looking character, of course, very short, trimmed beard. He's kind of got the Elpidophoros look going, as well as a weird, glassy set of eyes. So not trying to judge him too hard, but doesn't seem like a very trustworthy character. But the article goes on, the Estonian Orthodox Church is an autonomous body within the Moscow Patriarchate, which means it is, according to its 1920 tomos from St. Tikhon of Moscow, independent in economic, administrative, educational, and social matters concerning the Church. Due to His Holiness Patriarch Kirill's support for and various statements about the war in Ukraine and the Russian world concept, the Estonian parliament formally branded the Moscow Patriarchate a supporter of aggression in May. And despite the EOC's administrative independence and the fact that it has repeatedly voiced its disagreement with the war and the Russian world concept, the authorities apply this label of aggressor to it as well as a pretext of forcing it to submit to Constantinople or be banned altogether. So obviously this is not a good thing that we like to see. The EAOC, the Constantinopolitans, are clearly very much supporting this. I'm sure the EP and, his NATO backers have spoken to the leadership in Estonia, who are, some of the most egregious Russia haters, some of the most egregious, escalators of all these conflicts. I've still been suspicious that certain drones and forces have been launched even from Estonia. And of course, regarding the EOC, the Estonian Orthodox Church, their leader, Metropolitan Evgeny of Tallinn, he's pretty much been expelled from the country for no reason and has been residing in Russia for, at this point, I think well over a year. So the persecution isn't just in Ukraine. I think Estonia, with the exception of what's going on in Syria and the Middle East, of course, Christians persecuted there all the time. But as far as this European persecution goes, it seems that Estonia is very much the second front after, of course, the hot zone that is Ukraine, where so many churches have been stolen. But to provide another piece of news, unfortunately, this is bad news. Many people might have seen this already. This is also from Ortho Christian. The heads of multiple Georgian monasteries in America have been deposed. The Georgian Orthodox Diocese in North America has defrocked and removed the heads of 3 of its monasteries in America, the diocese announced on Tuesday. To the faithful of our holy diocese, we announce that as of March 17th of this year, the following clergy have been laicized. Archimandrite Athanasios Clark, former abbot of St. James the Apostle Monastery in Oklahoma. Archimandrite Christophoros Kadasak, former abbot of the Holy Spirit Monastery in Maryland. Additionally, Abbess Emilianae Hansen, the former egumena of St. Nina's Monastery in Maryland, has been deposed from her position. We call upon the faithful members of the Holy Orthodox Church to take this decision into full consideration. The Georgian version of the announcement also adds that former Abbess Emilianae has been stripped of her rank of egumena. The statement doesn't provide any details about why the 3 have been canonically deposed. However, all 3 and their monasteries are associated with Elder Dionysios Kalambokas, a highly controversial monk who is the spiritual head of a network of monasteries throughout Greece, Europe, and America. Elder Dionysios and his monasteries, both abroad and in America, have bounced around between jurisdictions and have even been associated with non-canonical clergy. Elder Dionysios has reportedly been expelled from both Mount Athos and the Holy Land in the past, and was himself reportedly defrocked by the Church of Greece in 2022. All of those statements are indeed true. I've been referring to it as the Dionysios Kalambokas cult. They've also been expelled from the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate, ROKOR, and the OCA. So this is sort of you got kicked out of 109 jurisdictions and it's not your fault sort of situation. But if anyone wants to learn more about this, you can go to the World War Now Discord. We, of course, have posted more links to this. Some of this stuff, there are accusations that haven't been 100% proven. I don't want to publicize a bunch of things that scandalize people. But to put a long story short, I view this Dionysios Kalambokas guy as sort of the anti-elder Ephraim. He's almost like he set up, dozens of these monasteries. Most of them have like 1 or 2 people in them chilling somewhere. But a few of them have a lot of members in Greece and in America specifically. He has some in Norway, Germany, France, Turkey even. Senegal, I believe, or Cameroon in Africa. So vast network of what appears to be a cult. He is a cult of personality. People refer to him as God. People are forced to write their confessions to him, and the confessions are shared throughout the cult. So there's information control. People bribe people and blackmail people with their confessions. And one of the big aspects of this cult is they convert people to orthodoxy under this cult of personality, immediately tonsure very young neophytes into monasticism, and then basically cause them to sign over their inheritance, their family's properties and estates over to the cult, which allows them to have a lot of money and resources. The main thing that I'll probably be following up on this is what actually happens to the properties. Of course, Bishop Saba, who is the head of these Georgian churches and monasteries, he has done the right thing here, but the question is, how did the diocese and the monasteries come to agreements regarding the property? I have a strong feeling because this is a cult that they made sure that their properties are held in trusts and LLCs and whatnot that are owned by the monks themselves, by this elder Dionysios guy himself, and that unfortunately the Georgians may have effectively just lost all of their monasteries in America by laicizing these people, because these people have already been fraternizing with genuine Orthodox Church bishops. I believe, quote unquote, Bishop Melchizedek of the genuine Orthodox Church has been helping Dionysios ordain and tonsure monks and whatnot. So I fear that these monasteries all might join a schismatic old calendarist group, which would provide even less accountability and oversight over this group who have abused people. There's allegations of sexual abuse, a lot of physical abuse, psychological abuse. So be sure to keep this whole situation in your prayers. I pray that these monasteries can be repopulated with actual pious monastics that are attempting to live the angelic life. So keep all of the situation in your prayers. And again, join the World War Now Discord. I've published more information about this cult. There's a lot of documentation. So check that out. I'm not going to be publishing all of that on the timeline or talking about it on the show because it's fairly grim stuff. But keep that situation in your prayers. But I want to end on some good news here. Also from Ortho Christian, Polish Church canonizes 3 priests killed in the World War II Katyn massacre. At its session on Tuesday, March 18th, the Holy Synod of the Polish Orthodox Church canonized 3 priests who were martyred in 1940 and those who were killed with them. In particular, the hierarchs canonized Archpriest Colonel Simon Fedorenko, Archpriest Lieutenant Colonel Viktor Romanowski, and Archpriest Major I guess it's the Polish version of Volodymyr's Okab, who were victims of the Katyn massacre, along with other clergy and laity whose names we know and do not know. Only Almighty God knows them, reports the Polish Church. The Katyn massacre was a mass execution operation carried out by the Soviet NKVD under Stalin's orders on April to May of 1940. Nearly 22,000 victims, including Polish military officers, police personnel, border guards, and intellectuals who were prisoners of war, were systematically killed. Though the executions took place at multiple locations, the atrocity became known as the Katyn massacre because some of the mass graves were first discovered by German forces in the Katyn forest in 1943. In 2010, the Russian parliament formally acknowledged Soviet leaders' culpability in the massacre. The Polish Synod stated, "Our Church of our Lord Jesus Christ, called by him to life throughout its history, has been and continues to be tested and persecuted. However, it's always strengthened by the martyrdom of Christ's faithful disciples. On every drop of martyrs' blood, new church life is built. The Orthodox Church in Poland has experienced these trials throughout its history. Therefore, our generation bows its head before their martyrdom and proclaims them saints. In history, we have done much in this regard. These are the martyrs of the time of the Union of Brest, the First and Second World Wars, and various resettlements of the faithful of our church." So it's always beautiful to have new saints in the church. It says that these canonizations will be celebrated with their feast on September 17th, which will be their feast day. The synodal hierarchs also approved the troparion and icons in their honor. So this has been wonderful to see. Obviously, we like to end on slightly more positive news, but these other things in the church are, generally negative. Of course, we're glad to see Metropolitan Theodosius released, but we have to hope that these persecutions in Ukraine and Estonia do come to an end. So, Dimitri, any last words you have for this week's episode? It has been quite a packed one indeed.
No, most definitely. I only encourage, of course, all of our subscribers and followers, those who've listened to the end, and you're hearing my words now, our dear listeners, definitely be following our Telegram pages, our X pages, follow up any of the posts we do, because we will be covering the news as it breaks literally throughout the week. And of course, most of the major stories we'll be covering on next Friday's episode. So definitely be checking that one out, because I think a lot will be happening in the next 7 to 8 days. So definitely stay tuned. And thank you again to all of our great subscribers. There's quite a bit of you. Join the Discord, especially if you're a subscriber, because there's definitely a lot of benefits there. We'll be talking to myself and Conrad, that is, and some of our great moderators. A lot of good collaboration happening. The community is most definitely growing, so we appreciate that. And I suppose I'll give one last positive story. Very interesting. A Tucker Carlson interview with Stephen Witkoff came out recently, Conrad, as you know, our favorite Donald Trump's Jewish billionaire, real estate mogul. And he told Tucker Carlson what happened between him and Putin in Moscow. And he said, after waiting for 8 hours in the waiting room for President Putin, when they did speak, Putin told him about what happened on the 13th of July, 2024, when, the Trump assassination attempt failed and the bullet grazed Trump's ear. President Putin went to his local priest at his local church, and he began praying for Donald J. Trump, not as a president, not out of diplomacy, but for a friend. So President Putin officially told Stephen Witkoff that he prayed for Donald Trump on the 13th of July last year, which I think, if the story is true, this would, of course, signal a lot. Most likely that President Putin's, of course, paying more attention to his Orthodox Christianity. And we can only say that's a great positive story, even though it's coming out of the mouth of Witkoff himself. But I think quite nice. And Tucker Carlson, I'm sure, was happy to hear that. And I'm sure Putin gave Mr. Witkoff an earful of historical references alongside the story itself. It wasn't just a pure diplomatic discussion. So a very interesting and kind of a cute story, I think, from that particular diplomatic visit.
Well, that is an interesting little detail, and I want to thank everybody, of course, for listening to this episode. It's been a long one, so if you made it here to the end, you are appreciated. I want to give a shout out to our paid subscribers. You're the ones that keep the lights on here at the proverbial World War Now, World War III bunker. Of course, you can become a member of our Ether Hour supporters, become, an elite World War Now soldier, as it were, by subscribing, getting behind the paywall on worldwarnow.co, also worldwarnow.substack.com. You get access to, at this point, hundreds of hours of Ether Hour content. I believe it is over 71 episodes. So we have guests Abbott Trefon, Father Peter Hears, Jim Jatteris, Anthony of Westgate, Syrian Girl, Cameron McGregor, Vince James, a whole host of other incredible guests, as well as solo episodes with Dimitri and I discussing, the last 6 czars of the Romanov dynasty, discussing a host of other saints and more obscure Orthodox stories, as well as some interesting cosmological lore, a whole bunch of things. So to hear all of that, please get behind that paywall. It keeps the show going. It keeps these free weekly shows possible as well. And be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. You'll search it on YouTube. It comes right up, because I'm going to be starting the World War live stream very soon, this coming Tuesday. If you're listening to this, I'll be going live likely around 7:30, 8 p.m. Central Time. So set reminders for that. I'm going to schedule the stream in advance. I want to see as many people there as possible. We're going to have super chats enabled, answering questions and all of that. And I want it to be a regular weekly thing. So be sure to tune into that. Obviously, Dimitri said, subscribe to our Telegram channel, World War Now Telly. Be sure to follow us on X at World War Now _. We're growing pretty fast there. Follow Dimitri on X at WWN host, and follow me, of course, at GnomeRad. I'm closing in on 10,000 followers, so help me get there sooner rather than later. It would be greatly appreciated. But you can also find us, of course, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and of course, worldwarnow.co. That is our home base. Get behind that paywall and help the show survive. But with all of that, I want to thank you again for listening. I want to ask you to keep Dimitri and I in your prayers, as well as, of course, those suffering around the world in the midst of this third world war. Pray for them as well. Pray for the persecuted. And thank you again for listening. We will see you on the next one. God bless.